There is a show that has been on the air longer than most of its own writers have been alive. A show that has outlasted every trend, every competitor, every industry prediction about how long something like this could possibly survive. A show that began as a collection of rough animated shorts on a variety program that nobody expected to last, and grew into the longest-running animated series in the history of American television, the longest-running sitcom in the history of American television, and one of the most discussed, analyzed, merchandised, and argued about pieces of popular culture the medium has ever produced. That show is The Simpsons. And the stories happening behind the scenes of its 36-year run are somehow stranger, messier, more dramatic, and more human than anything Springfield ever put on screen. The show spent decades holding up a mirror to American life, to the dysfunction of institutions, to the corruption of power, to the comfortable lies that communities tell themselves, to the gap between what people say they value and what they actually do. And all the while, behind the cameras, the production of The Simpsons was generating its own version of every story it was busy satirizing. There were legal battles and credit disputes, and creative wars, and identity controversies and pay standoffs and quiet betrayals and the slow, complicated business of what happens when an enormous amount of money starts flowing through a system that was never designed to handle it gracefully. So, settle in. Get comfortable. For the next 4 hours, we are going behind Springfield, into the places where the show was actually made, where the decisions were argued over and the deals were struck and the departures happened and the things nobody wanted to discuss publicly accumulated quietly across 3.5 decades. What we find back there is a story about ego and art and money and loyalty and the specific ways that creative ambition survives, or doesn't, inside the machinery of the entertainment industry. Let's get into it. Section 1. The real-life lawsuits that tried to kill The Simpsons. Before The Simpsons was the cultural institution it eventually became, before the theme park attractions and the merchandising empire and the 40-something seasons of television, and the legitimate claim to being one of the most influential pieces of popular culture in the history of the medium, it was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Several lawsuits, actually. The show's origin story is deeply tangled up in questions of credit and ownership and compensation, and those disputes began almost the moment the first episode aired in primetime, and it became clear that something genuinely valuable had been created. To understand why, you need to understand how the show actually came into existence, because the official story and the more complicated story diverge in ways that matter when you start looking closely at who got what. Most people know the origin myth in the form it has been told and retold for decades. Matt Groening, an alternative cartoonist who had built a devoted following in underground publishing circles through his comic strip Life in Hell, was invited to pitch animated segments for The Tracey Ullman Show, a variety program that Fox had launched in 1987. The original plan was for Groening to adapt Life in Hell for television. He traveled to the production offices for the meeting and realized, sitting in the waiting room, that adapting Life in Hell would require him to sign over the rights to characters he had spent years developing. Those characters were, at that point, his most significant creative asset outside of the show being proposed. Signing them over was something he was not willing to do. So he did something that has become one of the better-known anecdotes in television history. He sketched an entirely new family. He used a yellow legal pad, he drew quickly and somewhat roughly, and he gave each character a name taken from members of his own family. Homer for the father, Marge for the mother, and the names of his own siblings for 2 of the children. The third child, a baby girl, he named after himself in a roundabout way. In real life, his name was Matt. He called the baby Maggie. The mischievous boy he named Bart, which is an anagram of the word brat, a detail Groening has confirmed in various interviews over the years. This is a story about creative inspiration under pressure and about the instinct for self-preservation that shapes so many decisions in the entertainment industry. It is also a story about the foundation being laid, in that waiting room, for decades of legal and financial complexity that Groening could not have anticipated when he was drawing those first rough outlines of what would eventually become one of the most commercially significant franchises in the history of entertainment. The Tracey Ullman Show shorts ran for 3 seasons, airing between the longer-form segments of the variety program before the decision was made to expand the concept into a full half-hour primetime series. 2 people were central to making that expansion happen. James L. Brooks, the filmmaker and television producer whose credits included Terms of Endearment, Broadcast News and The Mary Tyler Moore Show, was one of the executive producers of The Tracy Ullman Show and became a champion of the Simpsons concept. His stature within the industry gave the project institutional credibility and protection at Fox that it might not otherwise have had. And Sam Simon, a television comedy writer whose credits included work on Cheers and Taxi, was brought in specifically to develop the half-hour series. Sam Simon's contribution to what The Simpsons became in its first seasons is something that has been debated and contested and acknowledged in various forms across the decades since he departed the show. People who worked in the writer's room during those early seasons consistently describe Simon as the person most responsible for translating a concept with genuine potential into a working piece of television. He built the writer's room. He established its culture. He developed the characters beyond their initial outlines, working with the voice cast to find the specific qualities that made each character feel real and funny and specific, rather than generic. He defined the show's tone, the particular combination of satirical observation and genuine emotional investment that characterized the best early seasons, and that is still cited as the standard against which the show's subsequent output is measured. He also had a creative relationship with Matt Groening that deteriorated fairly rapidly once the show became successful, and the stakes of their collaboration became undeniable. The specifics of what went wrong between them have never been fully disclosed. Both men were careful in the interviews they gave, neither directly accusing nor fully exonerating the other. Groening has acknowledged that their relationship became difficult. Simon's version of events, to the extent it was ever told publicly, suggested a profound disagreement about creative direction and about who deserved credit for what the show had become. Simon left after the third season. The official framing was that he wanted to pursue other projects. The industry understanding was that the relationship had become untenable in ways that made continued proximity impossible. What makes Sam Simon's story genuinely extraordinary is what happened after he left. Simon had negotiated his deal with the show's production entities well enough that he continued to receive a substantial share of The Simpsons' profits even after he stopped working on it. The details of his arrangement were never made public, but its effects were visible in the decades following his departure. Simon became wealthy, enormously wealthy, in a way that had nothing to do with anything he made after The Simpsons, because after The Simpsons he did not make anything that achieved comparable commercial success. He developed other projects. Some were interesting. None were The Simpsons. Then, in 2012, Sam Simon was diagnosed with colorectal cancer. The diagnosis was serious and the initial prognosis was not good. He was given months to live, an estimate that turned out to be an underestimate, as he survived for more than 2 years following the diagnosis. And in those 2 years, he undertook something that nobody who had known him primarily as a television comedy writer would necessarily have predicted. He started giving his money away on a scale that was genuinely remarkable. The charitable giving that Simon undertook in the years before his death in March of 2015 was extensive enough to constitute its own distinct legacy. He donated tens of millions of dollars to animal welfare organizations, to causes related to food security and hunger relief, to various charities that he had developed passionate commitments to across his life. He transformed a significant portion of his Simpsons fortune into a philanthropic operation that operated with genuine ambition and sustained financial commitment. By the time of his death, the estimates of his total charitable giving ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars when future commitments were included, alongside completed donations. The obituaries that followed Simon's death were genuinely complicated pieces of writing. They had to reckon with a man who was, by any fair assessment, among the most significant contributors to the early creative success of one of the most celebrated television programs in history, who had left that program under circumstances that were never fully explained, who had spent the subsequent decades in a state of creative semi-retirement while the thing he helped build continued without him, and made his estate progressively more valuable, and who ultimately channeled that accumulated wealth into a form of late-life purpose that was entirely disconnected from the entertainment world that had made it possible. He is a figure who resists easy categorization, which is perhaps appropriate given that he helped create a show that specialized in making easy categorization more difficult. The Tracy Ullman credit dispute that followed the show's primetime breakthrough is a story of a different character. Tracy Ullman herself, the performer around whose variety show The Simpsons shorts had originally aired, made public statements following the show's success, suggesting that she felt some form of financial recognition was owed to her for the role her program had played in incubating the concept. Her comments in interviews were pointed if not legally precise. She argued that without the Tracy Ullman Show there would have been no Simpsons, that the platform her program provided was a material contribution to the franchise's eventual success, and that the financial arrangements governing the franchise did not reflect that contribution. Fox and the show's production entities disagreed with this framing, and whatever legal position Ullman may have considered pursuing did not result in any formal action that became part of the public record. The dispute was resolved, or not resolved, in private. What it illuminated was a question that would recur across the show's history in various forms. In a creative enterprise involving many contributors at many stages of development, how do you define the boundaries of a contribution significant enough to merit financial participation in the enterprise's eventual commercial success? Ullman's claim that her show had been the launch platform was factually accurate. The legal argument that this entitled her to a share of the franchise's subsequent commercial success was considerably more complex, and the entertainment industry's long history of disputes over exactly this kind of question suggests that the complexity is less a feature of any specific case than it is of the underlying question itself. The copyright lawsuits from outside the production constitute another dimension of the show's legal history, and they are in some ways the most revealing because they illuminate how the show was perceived from entirely outside the industry. Beginning in the early 1990s and continuing at irregular intervals for years afterward, The Simpsons attracted claims from individuals and entities who believed the show had appropriated their creative work. The claim involving the British comic strip The Numbskulls is one that appears most often in discussions of the show's legal history. The Numbskulls, which had been running in the British children's magazine Beano since the 1960s, depicted tiny workers living inside a man's head and operating the various functions of his brain. When The Simpsons produced an episode that included a visual concept of tiny figures inside Homer's head, the creators of the Numbskulls argued that this was a derivation of their concept. The dispute eventually faded without formal resolution, but it illustrated something important about the show's legal vulnerability. With hundreds of episodes touching on virtually every corner of human experience and imagination, the probability of accidentally echoing something that already existed somewhere in the vast landscape of creative work was not insignificant. The case of the real Bart Simpson attracted attention out of proportion to its legal substance, largely because the coincidence at its center was genuinely striking in a way that made it irresistible to media coverage. There was, living in Springfield, Oregon, the same city that Groening had acknowledged as the inspiration for the show's setting, an actual man named Bart Simpson. This man filed a lawsuit alleging that the use of his name for one of America's most notorious fictional characters had caused him substantial harm, embarrassment, and reputational damage. The case was covered extensively by media outlets that found the symmetry too good to pass on. The real Bart Simpson, living in the real Springfield, suing the makers of the fictional Bart Simpson from the fictional Springfield. The case proceeded through several stages before being dismissed, with courts finding that the fictional character was not based on any real person, and that the shared name did not constitute the kind of misappropriation that would support a legal claim. But the case lingered in media coverage long after its legal resolution. Chester Lee Harding's claim represents the most audacious of the outside legal challenges. Harding filed a lawsuit in the mid-1990s, alleging that he was the true creator of The Simpsons, that he had pitched a concept for an animated family sitcom to Fox prior to the show's development, and that the show was a direct appropriation of his ideas. The claim was dismissed at the earliest stage, with the court finding no credible connection between Harding's alleged pitch and the actual creation of the show. But its existence is historically interesting less for its legal merits than for what it reveals about the cultural mythology surrounding the show's origin. By the mid-1990s, The Simpsons had become valuable enough and famous enough that claiming a piece of its creation was worth the effort of bringing a lawsuit with very limited prospects. The show had become a landmark, and landmarks attract people who want to claim they built them. The Carol Burnett lawsuit of 2003 is perhaps the most legally interesting case in the show's history because it touched on genuinely unsettled questions in media law. Burnett sued the production over a brief scene in which a character was seen cleaning floors in a manner she alleged evoked her famous charwoman character without her consent, in ways that violated her right of publicity. Fox countered that the scene constituted protected parody, The case attracted serious attention in media law circles because it raised questions about how far parody protection extends when applied not to a specific copyrighted work, but to a performer's personal creative signature. The case was eventually dismissed, but the reasoning involved generated scholarly commentary and contributed to the ongoing development of right of publicity law in California. What all of these legal episodes share is a single dynamic running through the franchise's history. Something was created by people who could not have predicted what it would become. The deals they made, the rights they kept and gave away, the credit structures they negotiated, all were made without knowledge of the commercial scale the property would eventually achieve. As the property grew, as the money grew, as the cultural significance grew, every aspect of the original arrangements came under pressure. People who had contributed found their contributions undervalued by existing structures. People who had not contributed found it worth trying to claim that they had. And the people who owned pieces of the franchise found those pieces more valuable than they had previously understood, and were reluctant to share that value with those who had helped create it. This is not a story unique to The Simpsons. It is a story as old as the entertainment industry. But The Simpsons lived that story out across a longer timeline and at a larger scale than almost any comparable situation. Every lawsuit, every credit dispute, every legal threat was, at its core, a version of the same question. Who made this thing, and who gets to benefit from it? 36 years later, those questions have been answered in legal terms, even if not always in terms that the people who asked them found satisfying. The Tracey Ullman Show era of The Simpsons is one of the most under-examined chapters in the show's history, partly because it precedes the cultural explosion that made The Simpsons a phenomenon, and partly because the work from that period is now genuinely difficult to access. The 48 shorts that aired on The Tracey Ullman Show between 1987 and 1989 are not included in standard DVD collections of The Simpsons. They are not available on streaming platforms. They exist in a kind of archival limbo, having never been formally integrated into the show's canonical television history, despite being the direct creative predecessors of everything that followed. Watching the early shorts, which can be found through unofficial channels, is a disorienting experience for anyone who comes to them expecting to recognize the show. The animation is rough, sometimes remarkably so. The characters look wrong in specific ways, their proportions not yet settled into the forms they would eventually occupy, their movements more limited and less expressive than they would become. The vocal performances are recognizable but still finding themselves. The stories are brief and simple, often little more than a single joke or a slice of domestic life expanded to 2 minutes. And yet something is already there. The specific texture of the Simpson family's dynamic, the way Homer's obliviousness coexists with genuine love, the way Marge's patience contains something durable and complicated, the way Bart's provocations are expressions of a kid who is always testing to find out what will hold, all of this is present in the early shorts, in the way that a person's essential character is present in childhood photographs. The form is immature, the development incomplete, but the thing that will eventually be there is already recognizable. The legal question of what the Tracey Ullman Show's production was owed as a result of incubating The Simpsons was one that Fox navigated with the same approach it applied to most of the credit and compensation disputes that arose around the franchise, a combination of legal argument, institutional pressure, and commercial settlement that resolved the immediate tension without fully satisfying the people who felt they had been inadequately recognized. The show that emerged from those 48 shorts was worth billions of dollars. The platform that hosted their development received none of the upside. The equity of that outcome was contested at the time and remains contestable. The Sam Simon situation is the most significant credit and compensation dispute in the show's history, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives in accounts of the show's origins. Simon's contribution to the show's first 3 seasons was not simply managerial. He brought to the project a specific vision of what a family comedy could be that influenced every aspect of the production. He developed the character voices and dynamics with the voice actors in ways that established the performances that persist to this day. He built the writer's room culture that produced the early season's most distinctive work. He shaped the tone of episodes in ways that made them feel warm without being sentimental and funny without being cynical. His estrangement from Groening, which remains incompletely explained by either party, produced one of the stranger arrangements in show business history. Simon stopped working on the show he had helped create after its 3rd season, but continued receiving a substantial share of its profits for the rest of his life. He became wealthy from a show he had left, and used that wealth in the final years of his life for philanthropic purposes that stood in striking contrast to the acrimony that had surrounded his departure from the production. People who knew Simon during those final years, the years of his illness and his giving, describe him as someone at peace with a complicated legacy. He had made something remarkable. He had been pushed out of it in ways he found painful. He had been financially compensated for it in ways that allowed him to do significant good in the world. The accounting of that life does not yield to simple judgment. What it yields to is the recognition that creative partnerships are among the most difficult human relationships to manage, that success can create pressures that destroy the collaborations it celebrates, and that the people who build something together are not always the people who can maintain it together. The lawsuits that came from outside the show are in some ways less interesting than the internal disputes, but they illuminate something important about how intellectual property functions in American culture. The Simpsons was not the first television show to attract claims from people who believed their creative work had been appropriated. It was not the last. It occupies a particular position in this history because of the scale of its success and the breadth of its content, which meant that the probability of any given person with any given creative work finding something to point at in the show's 800-plus episodes was genuinely significant. The legal standard for copyright infringement is specific. There must be access to the original work, and there must be substantial similarity in protectable expression. Proving access in the context of a television show that aired to tens of millions of viewers is generally not difficult. Proving substantial similarity in protectable expression is considerably harder, particularly when the claimed similarity is to a broad concept rather than a specific creative expression of that concept. Concepts are not protectable. Expressions of concepts are. The line between them is exactly where most intellectual property litigation in the entertainment industry lives, and it is a line that the Simpsons Productions legal team became very skilled at defending over the years. The cultural phenomenon of people reading into The Simpsons' origin story, a version of their own creative contribution, is interesting beyond its legal dimensions. It reflects something real about how creative influence works. The Simpsons emerged from a specific cultural environment and absorbed from that environment a wide range of influences, some acknowledged and some not, some consciously incorporated and some unconsciously absorbed. The people who worked in that environment, who produced work that existed alongside and in conversation with the work that eventually became The Simpsons, have some legitimate basis for feeling that the show owes something to the creative community in which it developed. The legal system does not recognize creative debts of that diffuse kind. The ethical accounting is more complicated. The question of what Groening specifically owes to the underground comics tradition from which he came is one that he has addressed more generously than the legal questions around specific claimants would suggest. He has been consistent in his acknowledgement of the alternative comics world as the environment that shaped his sensibility and made The Simpsons possible. The specific debts are harder to trace and have not generated the kind of legal disputes that more direct appropriation claims produced, partly because the underground comics tradition is less commercially organized, and partly because the relationship between influence and debt in artistic contexts is genuinely complex. The financial architecture of the show's ownership in its early years was established through deals struck in ignorance of what the show would become. This is true of essentially every entertainment franchise that achieves massive success. No one signs documents knowing in advance that the thing being created will be worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. The deals are made in conditions of uncertainty, with estimates of value that are informed guesses at best. When those guesses turn out to be far below the eventual reality, the people who negotiated from a position of underestimating the eventual value feel, quite reasonably, that they accepted less than they should have. The Simpsons' specific ownership structure evolved through the standard mechanisms of entertainment industry negotiation, which is to say through lawyers representing parties with asymmetric information and asymmetric power, reaching accommodations that resolved the immediate dispute without necessarily producing outcomes that felt entirely just to everyone involved. The people who have profited most from the franchise are the people who held the most negotiating leverage at the moment when the key deals were made, which is exactly how commercial entertainment works, and which is entirely separate from any assessment of creative contribution. Number. Section 2. The Writers' Room Wars. Chaos behind the curtain. If you want to understand what happened to The Simpsons over the course of its run, and why the show that produced the extraordinary television of its first 8 seasons is almost unrecognizable as the same program that has been airing in more recent years. You have to spend time in the writer's room. Not the version of the writer's room that gets depicted in affectionate retrospectives and DVD commentaries, but the actual room, the day-to-day reality of a place where some of the most creative and volatile people in American comedy spent their working lives in close quarters, trying to produce something brilliant under conditions that range from challenging to actively destabilizing. The early Simpsons writer's room is described by almost everyone who passed through it as one of the most intellectually stimulating creative environments in the history of television. This is not nostalgia softening memory. The evidence supports it. The hiring standard the show maintained in its first several seasons was exceptional in ways that distinguished it from virtually every other comedy production of its era. The writers who came into the room during the early seasons included people with graduate degrees from elite institutions, people with published academic work in mathematics and philosophy, people who had careers in science and law before transitioning into comedy writing. The room could produce, in a given afternoon of pitching, jokes that were simultaneously funny to a 12-year-old and to a professor of classical literature. That is a genuinely rare capability, and it was real during those years. The culture that developed in that room was one of competitive intellectual performance. Writers were expected not just to be funny, but to be funny in specific and informed ways, to build jokes from genuine knowledge of history and science and literature and popular culture, to hold their premises to a standard of internal consistency that exceeded what most comedy writers' rooms demanded. The show was doing things that had not been done before in animated television, particularly in its approach to satirical specificity and its willingness to reward an audience's intelligence, and the people making it knew they were doing something unusual. The showrunner structure of The Simpsons is central to understanding the show's creative trajectory, and it is somewhat unusual by the standards of American television. Most long-running series operate under relatively consistent creative leadership, with a creator or showrunner who defines the vision and maintains it across the run. The Simpsons has operated on a rotating model, with executive producer authority and day-to-day creative leadership passing through many hands. Matt Groening and James L. Brooks have remained in executive producer capacities throughout, but their day-to-day influence on specific creative decisions has varied considerably from era to era, and the showrunners who have actually run the production have had significant autonomy in shaping what the show is during their tenures. The founding phase of the show's writer's room was shaped decisively by Al Jean and Mike Reiss, who had been working in television comedy for several years when the show launched, and who helped establish the room's culture and standards during the first 4 seasons. Their tenure is remembered warmly by most people who worked under them, and the episodes produced during those years include many that are still cited as exemplars of the show at its most accomplished. Jean and Reiss left to develop their own projects, a decision that was entirely ordinary in the context of television careers, but that, in retrospect, marked the beginning of the talent turnover that would increasingly characterize the show's production. The seasons that followed their departure were shaped by successive different showrunners, each bringing different strengths and different instincts. David Merkin ran the show through seasons 5 and 6. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein ran it through seasons 7 and 8. These seasons are now widely regarded as the peak of the show's creative output, the period when The Simpsons was simultaneously most popular, most artistically ambitious, and most consistently excellent. The episodes from this era appear most frequently on lists of the show's best, are most often cited in academic and critical writing about the show, and are what fans most reliably invoke when they want to demonstrate what the show was capable of at its height. Understanding why those seasons were so extraordinary helps illuminate what was lost when they ended. The best episodes of seasons 4 through 8 share certain qualities that go beyond technical craft. They are grounded in specific emotional truths about the characters. They build toward moments of genuine feeling that the comedy has earned by taking the character's situation seriously. They are willing to be strange and emotionally raw in ways that are uncommon in comedy, and they manage the strangeness without losing the comedy. Consider the episode where Homer finds out his mother is alive and has been living underground for decades. The episode is funny in the specific, economical way the show was best at during those years. But it is also genuinely heartbreaking. Those two things coexist without either undermining the other. The comedy and the sadness are drawing from the same source, which is the specific truth of Homer's situation. a man who has spent his entire adult life with an unexplained void at its center, who discovers the explanation and finds that it does not make the void smaller. The show knows this. It sits with the feeling rather than escaping from it through a cutaway or a deflecting joke. That willingness to sit with a feeling is what distinguished the early show from much of what came after. Mike Scully's arrival as showrunner, beginning with Season 9, is the moment most frequently cited as the beginning of the show's creative decline. This marker has been invoked so often that it risks becoming a simplification of what was actually a more complicated and diffuse process. Scully is a capable television comedy writer who had worked on the show before, taking over as showrunner, who led the production through a period of continued commercial success, and who made specific creative decisions that many observers believe moved the show away from its most distinctive strengths. He is not a villain in this telling. He is a person who made choices in a difficult position, and some of those choices were wrong in ways that can be identified in retrospect. The episode that became the emblem of this shift, the one that critics and fans and former writers have returned to most often as evidence of a new creative philosophy at work in the room, is The Principal and the Pauper. In the context of the writer's room and its internal politics, the episode matters because of the response it provoked from within the production itself. Harry Shearer, who voices both Principal Skinner and Mr. Burns, expressed his displeasure with the episode in terms that were unusually direct for a cast member to use publicly about a specific episode of a show they were still working on. The episode was seen by a significant portion of the writing community as a fundamental betrayal of character integrity, a story that sacrificed the emotional truth of a long-established character in service of a premise that seemed clever in conception and felt hollow in execution. The creative departures that followed the transition to Scully's tenure were significant not just in numbers but in specific identity. The writers who left were not interchangeable with the writers who replaced them. The particular sensibilities that had guided the show through its golden years, the instincts about when to push an emotional beat and when to use comedy to deflect, about when a character's established qualities should constrain a storyline and when they could be stretched, those instincts were embodied in specific people. When those people left, they took those instincts with them. The new writers who arrived brought their own capabilities and their own approaches. But the institutional knowledge about what had made the early seasons extraordinary was distributed across the minds of the people who had been in the room when those seasons were being made, and as those people departed, that knowledge left with them. The specific creative disagreement that former writers have discussed most consistently, with varying degrees of directness, concerns Homer Simpson as a character. In the early seasons, Homer's stupidity was a specific kind of stupidity that was always in conversation with other qualities. He was careless but not cruel. He was oblivious but capable of genuine perception in moments that the show had carefully prepared for. He was selfish but loved his family in ways that were specific and believable. His failures arose from limitations he had not chosen rather than from a fundamental absence of decency. As the writing staff changed through the late 90s and into the 2000s, Homer began to operate by a different internal logic. He became more cartoonishly extreme in his stupidity and more actively unpleasant in ways that the earlier version of the character had carefully avoided. He did things to members of his own family that the Homer of Season 4 would not have done. The show's creators were aware of this drift. Various public statements over the years have acknowledged it. The term that fans developed to describe this version of the character, jerk-ass Homer, is a phrase that former writers and producers have acknowledged as capturing something real about a genuine shift in how the character was being written. The Flanderization problem is connected to the Homer problem but distinct from it. The word Flanderization, which derives from the fate of Ned Flanders as a character on this very show, describes the process by which a character is gradually reduced from a complex, multi-dimensional portrayal to a collection of their most easily caricatured surface traits. Ned Flanders began the show as a character whose devout religiosity was one aspect of a personality that also included genuine kindness, psychological complexity, and a repressed darkness that specific episodes explored with real care. Over time, as different writers with different levels of investment in the character's inner life handled him, Ned became primarily defined by his religious exclamations and his cheerful surface pleasantness. The depth receded, the shorthand remained, and the character became progressively less interesting as a result. This happened to multiple characters in the show's history. And the pattern suggests that it is not a failure specific to any individual writer or showrunner, but a structural tendency of long-running ensemble television. Characters develop legibility over time, shorthand ways of appearing on screen that communicate who they are quickly and efficiently. As those shorthand versions become the dominant mode of portraying the character, the qualities that gave rise to the shorthand recede. The efficient version displaces the full version. Al Jean's return as showrunner, beginning with season 13, represents the longest continuous creative stewardship in the show's history, more than 20 consecutive seasons. His management of the production has been professional and consistent. He has maintained the show's output at a level of technical quality that is remarkable for a franchise of its age. The episodes produced under his watch include genuine moments of creative distinction, episodes that remind even skeptical observers of what the room can do when the right circumstances align. What John's tenure has not consistently produced is the kind of television that generates sustained creative conversation. The show under his leadership has been a competent and occasionally distinguished version of something that was once genuinely transcendent. The gap between those two things is not Gene's personal failure. It is the accumulated weight of structural constraints, creative depletion, commercial pressure, and the mathematical impossibility of consistently producing something unprecedented when you have been producing variations of the same thing for 20-plus years. The writer's room has also had to contend with the show's own mythology in ways that become more constraining with each passing season. The accumulated weight of more than 700 episodes creates a continuity burden that is genuinely difficult to manage. Characters have expressed opinions, displayed knowledge, held jobs, and made choices that create contradictions when examined together. The writers must simultaneously ignore continuity for the purposes of the floating timeline while honoring it for the purposes of character consistency, and those two requirements pull in opposite directions, in ways that become more pronounced as the archive grows larger. What is remarkable, given all of this, is not that the show has declined from its early peak. What is remarkable is that it has survived at all. The forces arrayed against any long-running creative enterprise are powerful enough that most things do not last. The Simpsons has lasted through all of them, producing something like television every week for 36 years, and occasionally, even now, surprising its most skeptical observers with an episode that reminds them of what the room can do. That is a kind of institutional resilience that deserves acknowledgement, even in a story about the ways the institution has sometimes failed itself. The specific episodes that were produced during the Oakley-Weinstein era as showrunners stand as evidence that the conditions for great television existed then in ways that did not persist. Mother Simpson, which aired in season 7, is the episode most frequently cited by former writers as exemplifying what the show was capable of when it was working at its best. The story requires the audience to believe something that is genuinely difficult to sustain in a comedy. That Homer Simpson, the show's cartoon buffoon, has a rich and painful inner life that has been shaped by a loss he does not fully understand. The episode earns this belief through writing and performance that take the character's emotional reality seriously without ever abandoning the comedy that makes the show what it is. The sequence at the end of that episode, where Homer watches his mother drive away and sits alone on the roof of his car staring at the night sky, is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the show's history. No joke undercuts it. No cutaway relief valve releases the tension before it can be fully felt. The show holds the moment and lets the silence do exactly what silence does when there is nothing else adequate to the feeling. That is extraordinary television by any standard, and it is achieved without any of the formal pretensions that prestige drama uses to signal that it is serious. The question of what specifically changed in the writer's room culture between the Oakley-Weinstein era and the Scully era is one that multiple former writers have attempted to answer in interviews over the years, with varying degrees of directness. The answers converge on several themes. One is a shift in the kinds of pitches that were being encouraged. In the earlier room, story ideas that began from character, from asking what would genuinely matter to this person in this situation, were the standard from which episodes developed. As the room evolved, story ideas that began from premise, from a funny situation or a satirical target, became more common. The distinction sounds subtle, but it produces meaningfully different kinds of episodes. Another theme that emerges from former writers' accounts is a change in the kind of comedy the room was pursuing. The early room was interested in specificity. The joke that could only work in this episode, with these characters, in this situation, was valued over the joke that could have been inserted into any number of other episodes without loss of effect. Specificity requires deeper investment in the character's reality, in the specific contours of their world and their relationships. It produces comedy that feels inevitable rather than inserted. The shift toward more general comedy, toward jokes that are funny because they are constructed competently rather than because they emerge from the specific truth of the situation, is one that multiple observers have noted as a marker of the change in the room's culture. The physical and logistical demands on the writers have also changed across the show's history in ways that affect what the room can produce. The early writers worked in conditions that were, by television standards, relatively generous in terms of time. The show was being built from scratch. The characters' possibilities had not been fully explored. The institutional pressure to produce something that fit within an established template was minimal because the template was still being established. Writers had the latitude to try things that might not work, which is a precondition for producing things that are genuinely surprising. As the show has aged, as the template has become established, and the institutional investment in maintaining continuity within that template has grown, the constraints on what writers can attempt have increased. The library of 700-plus existing episodes creates a weight of precedent that newer writers must navigate. Characters have expressed positions and demonstrated capabilities and established relationships that create constraints on what can be written for them. The latitude to try something genuinely new, which in the early years was abundant, has diminished as the show's archive has grown. The former showrunners who have been most candid about the show's creative trajectory are also the most careful to distinguish between personal failure and structural constraint. Bill Oakley, in particular, has spoken about the show's evolution with a generosity toward his successors that is notable. He does not place the responsibility for what he sees as the show's creative decline on specific individuals who made wrong choices. He locates it in the accumulated weight of structural factors, in the way that the conditions for a certain kind of television become harder to maintain as time passes and pressures accumulate. This reading is more complicated and less satisfying than a narrative about villains and heroes, but it has the virtue of being more honest about how these things actually work. The fan communities that have formed around the show and its history have produced their own body of analysis that occasionally illuminates things that professional criticism misses. The online communities that developed around The Simpsons beginning in the early 1990s were, in some respects, more analytically rigorous than the professional critical discourse that ran alongside them. The people who participated in those communities had a relationship to the show's creative history that was built on close and repeated viewing in ways that professional critics, who watch things once or twice before writing about them, often could not match. The vocabulary that those communities developed, terms like Flanderization and zombie Simpsons, and the various era designations they applied to different periods of the show's history, passed into common use in a way that reflects how thoroughly the online fan analysis shaped the discourse around the show. When professional critics began writing about the show's decline in terms that overlapped substantially with what fan communities had been saying for years, they were, often without acknowledging it, catching up to an analytical conversation that had been running in online spaces for a decade or more. Al Jean's return to the showrunner role and his sustained tenure in that position since season 13 represent an attempt to bring institutional continuity to a production that had been characterized by frequent leadership changes. Jean's approach to that continuity has been defined by a kind of professional competence that is genuinely admirable within the constraints it operates under. The show he has produced for more than 20 years is not the show he first helped build, and he is aware of that. What he has managed to produce is a show that maintains a standard of craft and care that prevents it from becoming genuinely bad even when it cannot consistently become great. Number Section 3. The voice cast strikes, pay disputes, and near replacements. There are 6 voices that define The Simpsons more completely than any other element of its production. The animation has changed substantially over the decades, evolving from the somewhat rough and irregular visual style of the early seasons to the cleaner, more consistent look of the later ones. The music has evolved. The stories have changed in character and tone and ambition, but the voices have remained, and the specific vocal qualities that each of the 6 principal performers brings to their characters are the constant that holds the show's identity together across every other change it has undergone. This is not simply an observation about vocal performance. It is an observation about the nature of character identity in animation specifically. When you watch a live-action television show, The character exists in a physical embodiment that is inseparable from a specific actor's face and body and physical presence. Replace that actor and you have not merely a different performance but a visibly different person. Animation does not work this way. The character's visual form is fixed by the drawing. The animators can change, the artistic style can evolve, and the character's face remains the same across all of it. What a voice actor provides to an animated character is therefore something qualitatively different from what a live actor provides. Not a physical embodiment, but a specific emotional and cognitive texture. A way of being in the world that is encoded in the grain of the voice, the rhythms of the delivery, the specific choices about how a character hears and responds to what is happening around them. When Dan Castellaneta says something as Homer, the character is not simply speaking Homer's words. He is manifesting a specific version of Homer's relationship to experience, one that has been developed and refined across hundreds of hours of performance, and that cannot be replicated by a different voice, any more than a different face could replicate a specific physical embodiment. The irreplaceability that the Simpsons cast has maintained across 3 major contract disputes is not the irreplaceability of celebrity status or public fame. It is something more fundamental, the irreplaceability of a specific creative relationship between a performer and a character that has been developed over the course of decades. Fox understood this, the actors understood this, and from that mutual understanding, across multiple rounds of negotiations spanning more than 20 years, came a series of labor disputes that tested the relationship between them and forced each side to reckon seriously with the possibility that the other might be willing to do something costly. The first major contract standoff took place in the late 1990s as the show was moving into its 9th season. At that point, the 6 principal voice actors were earning approximately $75,000 per episode. The number is genuinely substantial money in absolute terms. It requires context, however. The Simpsons by the late 90s was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually across its various revenue streams: primetime advertising, syndication licensing, international distribution, and a merchandise operation that was among the most profitable in the entertainment industry. The per-episode fee being paid to the people most fundamentally responsible for what made the franchise irreplaceable was a very small fraction of the value those people were generating. The actors sought an increase to $125,000 per episode. Fox responded with resistance. The negotiations extended over a period of months, during which Fox made what was characterized by various parties as a credible threat to recast the show with different voice actors. This threat was treated with varying degrees of seriousness by different observers. Some believed Fox had genuinely done the financial analysis and was prepared to proceed. Others believed the threat was primarily a negotiating tactic, designed to create a credible worst-case alternative that would make Fox's preferred settlement terms seem more reasonable by comparison. The cast maintained their position. The standoff was eventually resolved with the actors receiving the increase they had sought to approximately $125,000 per episode. The second major dispute, which unfolded in 2004, was more public, more prolonged, and more revealing of the underlying dynamics. By this point, the actors were earning approximately $360,000 per episode. They were seeking $750,000 per episode, a number that attracted enormous media attention and was treated by many commentators as evidence of Hollywood excess on a scale that invited specific criticism. The coverage of this dispute is worth examining carefully because of how the framing shaped public perception. When coverage focused on the absolute dollar figures being sought, the actors appeared to be wildly overpaid performers demanding more of something they already had too much of. When coverage focused on the relative economics, the proportion of the franchise's total revenue represented by the actors' collective compensation, the picture was considerably more complicated. The franchise was generating enormous sums. The actors, who were the irreplaceable creative core of the product, were seeking a larger share of the value they were creating. Whether the specific number they sought was exactly right or somewhat high was less important than the underlying question of fair compensation relative to the value being generated. Fox again threatened recasting. This time, the threat was accompanied by a public statement suggesting the studio had identified potential replacement voice actors and was prepared to proceed if necessary. Animation industry professionals who commented publicly expressed considerable skepticism about whether Fox genuinely intended to follow through. Replacing Marge, for instance, was not simply a production decision. Julie Kavner's voice is Marge Simpson's voice in a way that is not separable. The specific roughness, the contained strain, the quality of warmth held in tension with something darker, all of it arises from qualities of Kavner's own vocal instrument that cannot be replicated through technique alone. She has spoken in interviews about the physical toll that voicing the character takes, and about the connection between the character's distinctive sound and the specific demands it makes on her voice. To replace that voice would not be to find someone who could approximate the sound. It would be to introduce something fundamentally different into the center of the show's emotional life. The dispute was eventually resolved through a compromise that landed below the actor's original request but well above what Fox had initially offered. The specific numbers were not publicly confirmed, but industry reporting suggested the actors settled at somewhere in the range of $500,000 per episode. The resolution was achieved through a process involving formal mediation and extended negotiations over several months. Harry Shearer's situation deserves extended attention because it is qualitatively different from the group negotiations and reveals something important about what happens when a cast member's relationship to a production complicated by factors beyond financial compensation. Shearer is an artist of considerable range and reputation entirely independent of The Simpsons. His work on This Is Spinal Tap, which he co-created and starred in, is a landmark of comedy filmmaking that would constitute a significant legacy on its own. His long tenure on Saturday Night Live, his extensive work in radio and documentary filmmaking, his writing and directing projects, these represent a career that exists in genuine distinction from his work on The Simpsons. This independence has given Shearer a relationship to the production that differs from that of the other cast members, most of whom have built their public identities more completely around their Simpsons work. Shearer has been more willing to criticize the show publicly when he disagrees with specific creative decisions. He expressed his concerns about the principal and the pauper with unusual directness for a cast member in an ongoing employment relationship. He has described frustration with aspects of the show's evolving creative approach. He has not presented himself as a company man in the way that long-term employment relationships generally encourage. The culmination of these tensions came in 2015, when Shearer announced that he would not be returning to the show at the expiration of his current contract. His stated reason was a dispute over exclusivity clauses that he felt restricted his ability to pursue other creative work. The actual reasons, as best as can be understood from public statements and from commentary by people close to the production, were more layered. A combination of genuine concern about the contractual terms and a longer-standing dissatisfaction with the direction the show had taken in its later years. Fox's public response came in the form of an offer to modify the exclusivity terms he had objected to, made through a statement that was unusually direct in its form. The negotiations played out in public in a way that was unusual for contract disputes in the entertainment industry, which typically occur behind non-disclosure walls. Then, Shearer returned. After several weeks during which his departure had seemed final, he came back to the show with what were described as modified contract terms. The audience, which had been following the story with genuine anxiety about the prospect of The Simpsons without the voice of Mr. Burns and Ned Flanders and Principal Skinner, was relieved. What the near departure revealed is something that the show's longevity makes easy to overlook. The continued existence of The Simpsons in anything like its recognized form depends on the continued participation of a small number of specific people who have spent decades developing irreplaceable creative relationships with specific characters. If one of those people decided definitively to stop, the show would face a choice between ending a chapter of its history in a way that would be acknowledged and noted, or attempting to continue in a diminished form that would remind everyone of the absence at its center. Neither option is commercially attractive, which is why the production has consistently found ways to reach agreements that keep the cast intact. Nancy Cartwright's public life has developed a complication that sits awkwardly alongside her role as the voice of one of American television's most beloved characters. Cartwright is a member of the Church of Scientology, and her involvement with the organization became a source of significant public controversy when it emerged that she had recorded an automated phone message using Bart Simpson's voice to invite people to a Scientology event. The use of the character's voice for this purpose was explicitly not authorized by Fox or by the show's production. Both issued statements making clear that the unauthorized use of the character in this context was not sanctioned and was not appropriate. Cartwright has remained publicly associated with Scientology throughout the years since. The awkwardness of her association with the organization, Given the show's long history of satirizing organized religion and institutional religious authority, has been noted by many observers without generating any formal response from the production beyond the initial statement about the unauthorized phone message. The financial dimension of what the cast members have earned from the show across its run is genuinely remarkable in both its absolute scale and in what it reveals about the economics of the franchise. At the peak of their per-episode fees, the six principals were collectively earning more than $3 million per episode of the show, for a show that produces in the range of 22 episodes per season. The total compensation across the show's run for each of the six principal cast members represents a financial outcome that is extraordinary by virtually any standard of comparison. It is also, as we have noted, relatively modest when set against the total commercial value of the franchise, in which their performances are the irreplaceable creative core. Both things are true simultaneously, and that simultaneous truth is the heart of what made the negotiations so consistently difficult. They stayed, in the end, all of them, through every negotiation and every standoff, and every almost departure, and every resolution that left someone feeling like they had given more than they received. And because they stayed, the show continued. And because the show continued, they continued to earn. The loop is self-sustaining in a way that makes the exits and near exits it has survived seem, in retrospect, like temporary disturbances to an arrangement that was always going to hold. The economics of the voice acting arrangement deserve closer examination than they typically receive. The numbers involved in the various contract negotiations are genuinely striking, but what is more striking is the degree to which those numbers reflect a fundamental asymmetry in how the entertainment industry values different kinds of creative contribution. Hank Azaria's position in the cast was complicated by the number of characters he voiced, which was substantially larger than any other cast member's portfolio. Beyond Apu, Azaria had developed voices for Moe, the bartender, Chief Clancy Wiggum, Professor Frink, Comic Book Guy, and dozens of recurring and one-off characters throughout the show's run. The breadth of his contribution made him uniquely valuable to the production in ways that went beyond his headlining character, and that breadth shaped the negotiations in which he participated differently than they might have if his work had been confined to a single role. The question of what constitutes fair compensation for creative work of this kind has no objective answer. The entertainment industry has developed norms around it that are themselves products of historical labor negotiations, power imbalances, and market conditions rather than principled ethical reasoning. The fact that the six principal cast members of The Simpsons have, between them, earned more than virtually any other voice acting cast in history is a reflection of their success in negotiating those norms upward, not a reflection of any prior agreement that they deserved that level of compensation. Nancy Cartwright's relationship to the Bart Simpson character over the course of the show's run is one of the more psychologically interesting stories in the history of celebrity. She has described in interviews the specific ways in which inhabiting the character for decades has shaped her. Bart's voice is a specific physical production that Cartwright has performed thousands of times, and the relationship between the performed voice and the performer's own identity is something she has spoken about with notable thoughtfulness. She is not Bart, but she has been Bart, in the specific sense of having channeled a character's energy and perspective through her own body, for longer than most actors have maintained any single role. The creative relationship between a performer and an animated character they have voiced for 36 years is genuinely novel, and the psychological dimensions of that relationship are not well understood. Yeardley Smith's position in the cast has always been somewhat different from the others. She voices a single character, Lisa Simpson, and that character's specific qualities, her intelligence, her moral seriousness, her loneliness, create a performance demand that is distinct from the demands placed on the cast members who voice multiple characters or whose characters operate primarily in comedic registers. Lisa's most emotionally powerful moments require something from Smith that is not simply technical vocal performance. They require genuine feeling, the kind of emotional access that makes the character's grief or frustration or hope feel real rather than performed. Smith has spoken about the emotional weight of those scenes with a candor that suggests they genuinely cost her something to produce. Harry Shearer's departure threat in 2015 reverberated through the fan community in a way that was out of proportion to the specific contractual dispute at its center. And understanding why requires understanding what Shearer's characters represent to the show's identity. He voices Mr. Burns, who is the show's primary villain and one of its most complex characters, a figure who operates simultaneously as satire and as genuine dramatic presence. He voices Ned Flanders, who is one of the show's richest supporting characters and the moral foil to Homer's casual amorality. He voices Principal Skinner, whose entire existence as a character was complicated by the Armin Tamzarian episode, but whose voice and manner remain central to the show's Springfield as an environment. The prospect of Shearer leaving permanently raised a question that had always been theoretical. What would The Simpsons be without the specific creative intelligence he brings to those characters? The question became more pressing because Shearer's approach to his characters is so distinctive, so informed by his specific theatrical sensibility and his particular understanding of what each character is doing in the show's ecology, that replacing it would not be a matter of finding someone who could approximate the voice. It would require someone who could approximate the interpretive intelligence behind the voice, which is a different and considerably harder thing to find. The resolution of that near departure produced a modified contractual arrangement that addressed the specific concerns Shearer had raised about exclusivity. The specific terms have not been publicly disclosed in detail, but they were understood to give Shearer more latitude to pursue outside creative projects than the previous arrangement had provided. Whether this reflects a genuine evolution in how the production views the relationship between long-term cast members and their other professional obligations, or simply a pragmatic response to an immediate crisis, is not entirely clear from the public record. What the episode established definitively is that the show, even after decades of operation, remains fundamentally dependent on the specific people who provide its voices in ways that no contractual arrangement can fully protect against. A contract can establish terms. It cannot manufacture the specific creative relationship between a performer and a character that has been built across hundreds of hours of performance. That relationship exists in the performer, and when the performer leaves, it leaves with them. The show's success in retaining all 6 principal cast members across its entire run is viewed in this light, one of the more remarkable institutional achievements in the history of American television. Section 4. The episodes that were banned, pulled, or buried. Every long-running television show accumulates episodes that it would rather not discuss. Shows that have run for decades carry within their catalogs things that felt right at the time of production and seem much more complicated in retrospect. Things that were pulled from rotation for reasons that were sometimes principled and sometimes merely practical. Things that exist in different versions in different markets because of decisions accumulated over years of negotiations and sensitivities, and editorial choices that were each made in isolation and that collectively produced an archive less stable and complete than it appears from the outside. For The Simpsons, the list of suppressed, altered, or controversial episodes is substantial enough to constitute its own significant body of history. Understanding these episodes and the decisions that shaped their fate tells you something important about the show's cultural context and about the limits of creative freedom inside the commercial and institutional frameworks in which the show has always had to operate. The most discussed and most dramatically resolved of these episodes is Stark Raving Dad, which aired as the first episode of Season 3 on September 19, 1991. For nearly 3 decades, it was one of the most fondly remembered in the show's history. The premise places Homer in a mental institution after a computer system flags him as a potential threat, where he meets a large white man who claims to be Michael Jackson. The character is never explicitly identified as Jackson within the episode, but he is voiced by a performer credited under the pseudonym John J. Smith, who was in reality Michael Jackson performing under an assumed name. The backstory of Jackson's participation is, on its own, a remarkable piece of show business history. Jackson was at the peak of his fame in 1991, one of the most recognized human beings on the planet by any available measure. He was also, by multiple accounts, a devoted fan of The Simpsons who had followed the show from its earliest episodes. He reached out to the production through intermediaries and expressed a desire to be involved. The terms that were worked out allowed him to participate while maintaining public deniability about his involvement. He wanted the credit to read as a pseudonym. He wanted the vocal performance to appear under a different name, and he wanted the connection to be an open secret rather than a disclosed fact, understood by industry insiders without being officially confirmed. The episode built around his participation is genuinely excellent television. It is warm and creative, and the Michael Jackson stand-in becomes the vehicle for an emotionally satisfying arc about Homer's relationship with Lisa. The birthday song that the character composes and performs for Lisa, written by Jackson himself, is a piece of music that works entirely on its own merits. The episode's critical reputation was high, and its fan following was devoted. In 2019, everything changed. The documentary Leaving Neverland aired and presented detailed and extensively developed allegations of child sexual abuse by Michael Jackson, made by two men who described abuse they say they experienced as children. The allegations were contested by Jackson's estate. They were taken seriously by many viewers, critics, and cultural institutions, including radio stations that removed Jackson's music from rotation and various other entities that reconsidered their associations with his work and legacy. In March of 2019, James L. Brooks announced that Stark Raving Dad was being pulled from all circulation. The episode was removed from Fox's streaming platform, from syndication packages, and from the DVD collection in which it had previously been included. The decision was presented as a direct response to the documentary, and to what Brooks described as the changed context in which the episode now existed. Al Jean and Matt Groening both commented on the decision. Jean described it as appropriate given what had been revealed. Groening was somewhat more equivocal, describing the situation as genuinely sad while supporting the withdrawal. The decision was not legally required. The episode contained nothing that depicted anything inappropriate. The guest performer's presence in it was, by the standard of the work itself, entirely above reproach. What had changed was not the episode's content but the cultural meaning of being publicly associated with Michael Jackson, which had been fundamentally altered by the documentary's claims. The decision to pull Stark Raving Dad rather than simply allowing it to remain available without promotion raises questions that have not been comprehensively answered. Pulling the episode does nothing to address the alleged harm the documentary depicts. It does not benefit the people who made the allegations. What it does is sever the franchise's commercial and cultural association with a figure whose name has become deeply contested. Whether that serves any legitimate ethical purpose beyond institutional self-protection is a question that reasonable people have debated at length since the decision was made. The post-September 11th alterations represent a different and, in some ways, more quietly consequential chapter in the show's history. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks of September 11th, 2001, the broadcast television industry conducted a rapid review of scheduled and recently completed content for material that might be considered insensitive in the context of a tragedy that had produced thousands of deaths and a profound state of collective shock. The review was industry-wide, and the decisions made were generally understood at the time as reasonable responses to extraordinary and recent catastrophe. For The Simpsons, the most significant immediate change was the pulling of the episode The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, which features Homer's car being towed and parked between the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The episode was removed from syndication rotation. When it was eventually returned to availability, scenes featuring the Twin Towers were edited out. This was not an unusual kind of decision in the post-September 11th period, when images of the destroyed buildings were treated with a sensitivity that meant even incidental fictional references were removed from existing media. But the edits meant that the canonical version of the episode available to most viewers was meaningfully different from the episode as originally produced and aired. Several other episodes underwent modifications during this period. Jokes that made reference to airplanes in newly charged contexts were overdubbed or removed. The production reviewed upcoming episodes and made changes to scripts and completed animation. The decisions were made individually and relatively quickly, without the benefit of the kind of systematic review that a longer timeline would have permitted. The result was a collection of changes applied somewhat inconsistently, guided more by a general principle of caution than by a coherent editorial philosophy. The long-term implication of these changes is that multiple episodes of The Simpsons exist in versions different from the original broadcasts, and those changed versions are the ones that most viewers encounter when watching the show in syndication or on streaming platforms. The show's archive is incomplete and partially altered in ways that are not always disclosed to the viewer. The Apu situation deserves mention here as well, in the specific sense of what happened to the show's practical handling of that character following the controversy that we will discuss in full in the next section. The practical effect of the controversy was a form of quiet removal that operated without any formal announcement or acknowledgement within the show itself. The character went from being a recurring featured presence to appearing only in background crowd scenes and then to essentially disappearing from the show altogether following Hank Azaria's announcement that he would no longer voice the character. No episode addressed this change. No storyline explained where Apu had gone. The show simply allowed him to become absent, in a process that mirrored the mechanisms of collective forgetting that the show had always depicted in Springfield. The syndication editing question is a dimension of the show's content history that affects more of the audience's experience than any of the more dramatic withdrawals and controversies, but receives far less attention. Syndicated episodes of The Simpsons are significantly shorter than the original broadcast versions. The cuts made for syndication are driven by time requirements, by the need to fit the episode into a slot that includes additional commercial breaks, and they are generally made without reference to the narrative or comedic integrity of what is being cut. What gets removed is whatever is most easily removed, which is often precisely the material that established the emotional setup for a later payoff, or the joke that requires specific earlier context to land, or the character moment that makes everything else in the episode cohere. The result is that a significant portion of the audience that has encountered The Simpsons primarily through syndication has experienced versions of many episodes that are meaningfully inferior to the versions that originally aired. The cuts are not random, but they are not editorially considered in any way that accounts for the show's specific creative intentions. They are mechanical decisions made in service of commercial requirements, and they have quietly altered the audience's relationship to the show's actual output in ways that are rarely acknowledged. These cases across their differences reveal that the canon of The Simpsons is more unstable than it appears. The show we can watch is not identical to the show that was made. Some of what was made is unavailable. Some of what is available exists in altered form. The relationship between the show's creative output and the audience's access to that output has been shaped by legal decisions, ethical calculations, political sensitivities, and commercial economics in ways that are rarely made explicit. Springfield's history, like all histories, is a selective version of what actually happened. The question of what gets preserved and what gets lost in these institutional decisions is one the show's most thoughtful observers have wrestled with. When Stark Raving Dad was pulled from circulation, the practical effect was to make an episode that had been freely available for nearly 30 years suddenly impossible to access through any official channel. Fans who owned physical copies of the episode on DVD or who had recorded it from broadcast retained their copies. People who had never seen it and wanted to find it were directed toward unofficial sources, which is an irony that the show's own satirical sensibility might have appreciated. The effort to distance the franchise from uncomfortable associations drove interested viewers toward the exact uncontrolled distribution channels that corporate IP management is designed to prevent. The question of what the withdrawal accomplished in ethical terms is one that reasonable people continue to disagree about. Michael Jackson's estate has contested the allegations made in Leaving Neverland with considerable force. The two men who made the allegations have testified to experiences they say were traumatic and real. Neither of these positions cancels the other out. The cultural meaning of the episode exists now in a state of permanent uncertainty, associated with a controversy that will not be resolved in the near term and possibly not in the long term. What the decision to pull the episode does establish clearly is a precedent that the Simpsons franchise is willing to withdraw previously available content from its catalog in response to changed cultural circumstances surrounding a specific person associated with that content. That precedent has implications that extend beyond the Stark Raving Dad situation. If the standard is that content featuring someone whose cultural associations have become problematic warrants withdrawal, the franchise has a significant catalog to review. The episodes featuring Bill Cosby, who guest starred in the show before the revelations about his conduct became public, have not been withdrawn. The episodes featuring other celebrities who have subsequently been associated with various forms of misconduct remain available. The specific application of the withdrawal principle to Stark Raving Dad, and not to other similarly situated content, suggests that the decision was driven at least in part by the magnitude of the specific allegations, by the proximity of the relationship between the episode's existence and the person's vocal performance, and by the commercial calculus of association with one of the most contested legacies in pop music history. Syndication editing has shaped the audience's experience of The Simpsons in ways that extend far beyond the dramatic cases of withdrawal and alteration. The vast majority of viewers who encountered the show during the years when it was most culturally dominant did so through syndicated reruns rather than through original broadcasts. Syndication brought the episodes to afternoon television slots, to local stations and markets where the show was new, to the endless rerun cycles that turned casual viewers into devoted fans. And syndication routinely excised between 2 and 5 minutes from each episode to accommodate additional commercial time. Those missing minutes represent a significant portion of what made the episodes work. The show's best episodes are engineered with considerable care. Scenes set up payoffs that come later. Character moments establish emotional resonance that the comedy then earns by returning to. The jokes that appear in the corners of scenes, the background gags, the throwaway lines that reward attentive watching, many of these exist in the portions of episodes that syndication most readily removes. The syndicated version of even the show's best episodes is often a somewhat diminished version of the original, and for many viewers, the syndicated version is the only version they have ever seen. The streaming era has, in principle, made it possible for viewers to access the full original broadcast versions of episodes for the first time since those original broadcasts. In practice, the versions available on Disney Plus are not uniformly identical to the original broadcasts. There are music licensing complications that have resulted in some substitutions in the sound design of certain episodes, changing in small but sometimes meaningful ways the specific musical choices that the original editors made. The pursuit of a completely authentic version of The Simpsons archive is, it turns out, more complicated than simply finding the right streaming service and pressing play. Number. Section 5. The Apu Scandal and the Identity Debate That Split the Fanbase. In 2017, a stand-up comedian named Hari Kondabolu released a documentary through True TV called The Problem with Apu. The documentary was not the kind of production that typically reshapes cultural conversations. It was made without major studio backing, distributed on a cable network with modest reach, and built around interviews with South Asian American comedians and writers talking about their personal experiences with a fictional cartoon character. By the metrics that typically determine a documentary's cultural impact, it should not have done much. Instead, it ignited a conversation that the entertainment industry had been steadily avoiding for years, forced a reckoning that one of the most celebrated shows in television history was entirely unprepared for, and produced a sequence of events that illustrated with unusual clarity both the specific ways that comedy can cause real harm without intending to, and the specific ways that institutions respond to criticism when they are more invested in protecting their past than in engaging honestly with the questions being raised about it. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalan was introduced in the second episode of The Simpsons' first season. He runs the Quick E-Mart convenience store, works hours that no reasonable labor law would permit, holds an advanced academic degree that his immigrant circumstances have made professionally inaccessible, and speaks in an accent that was performed by Hank Azaria, a Greek-American actor who is not South Asian, using a caricatured approximation of South Asian speech patterns. Over the following seasons, Apu became one of the most developed of the show's recurring characters. He was given a rich backstory, a marriage, 8 children, a complex relationship to the immigrant experience, and storylines that took his character's interior life seriously in ways that the show's treatment of minor characters often did not. He also became, for many South Asian Americans who grew up in the 1990s and 2000s, the dominant image of South Asian people in American popular culture. Not because Apu was the only South Asian character in American entertainment, but because The Simpsons was so widely watched and so thoroughly embedded in the mainstream that Apu's specific portrayal carried a weight that no other depiction could match. When you are part of a community that is rarely depicted in mainstream media, the depictions that do exist carry an outsized representational burden. They become default references because there is nothing else available to complicate or contextualize them. Kondabolu's documentary asked a question with a complex answer. What does it mean to grow up South Asian in America when the most prominent cultural image of South Asian people is an accent used primarily for mockery? The question was not abstract. The documentary was built around the testimony of specific people describing specific experiences. South Asian comedians and writers described being greeted with Apu impressions by strangers and classmates, being told to do the voice, being met with the phrase that had become most associated with the character. The experience of encountering a mainstream cultural portrait of your entire heritage and finding that portrait deployed as a tool for making you feel like an outsider is something that Kondabolu's interviewees described with specificity and emotion. The harm documented in the film was not the harm of Apu's characterization in isolation within the show. Within The Simpsons itself, Apu is frequently portrayed with genuine depth, with a sophisticated relationship to the contradictions of the immigrant experience. The harm arose in the gap between how the character was used within the show and how the character, or specifically the accent, was used by audiences in the world outside the show. The voice actor's caricature became a social weapon in ways that the show's writers, working inside a room that did not include South Asian voices, were not positioned to anticipate or account for. The show's initial response to the documentary was a miscalculation. The episode No Good Read Goes Unpunished, which aired in April of 2018, included a scene in which Marge reads a children's book she had loved as a child and discovers that it contains a character who is a racial stereotype. She attempts to revise the book to remove the offensive elements and finds that removing them makes the book unreadable. The episode concludes with Lisa breaking the fourth wall, acknowledging that it is hard to revisit beloved cultural artifacts and accept that some things once considered acceptable now require different treatment. It was a response that managed to acknowledge the critique while simultaneously arguing that the critique was unanswerable, that the show was caught between its history and the demands of the present in a way that could not be resolved cleanly. The audience that had raised the concerns about Apu experienced it differently. It read as a dismissal wrapped in the language of good faith engagement. It said, "We know there is a problem, and we are telling you that knowing there is a problem is all we are prepared to do about it." Al Jean's public comments during this period were carefully chosen. He expressed that the show was taking the concerns seriously while also defending Apu's characterization as, on balance, a positive portrayal of an immigrant character given depth and complexity. Both of these things were true, and neither of them addressed the specific harm that Kondabolu's interviewees had described. The harm was not that Apu was poorly written within the show. The harm was that the accent had been extracted from the show and used in the social world in ways the show did not control and had not anticipated. Hank Azaria's personal reckoning with the character is a different story from the institution's reckoning, and worth treating as its own chapter because it demonstrates something important about how an individual can engage honestly with a complex question that an institution is reluctant to confront. In January of 2020, Azaria announced that he would no longer voice Apu. The announcement was accompanied by a statement in which he described conversations he had had with members of the South Asian community, including a school visit during which he spoke with students about the impact of Apu's portrayal. He described those conversations as transformative, as having given him an understanding of the character's impact that he had not previously possessed. He apologized specifically and directly in terms that acknowledged real harm without hiding behind the complexity of the question. Azaria also reached out directly to Kondabolu. The two men spoke. Kondabolu has described those conversations as constructive and has noted that Azaria's willingness to engage genuinely with the concerns he had raised was meaningful to him. Kondabolu has also expressed some ambivalence about Apu's disappearance from the show, suggesting that what he had wanted was not the character's removal, but his transformation into something more complex and more truthfully rendered. Disappearance resolved the immediate commercial problem for the production without addressing the representational question in any way that might be instructive for how similar situations are handled going forward. The fanbase response to the Apu controversy was revealing in the specific ways different portions of the audience position themselves. A significant portion, particularly those who had grown up with the show and had no personal experience of the specific harm Kondabolu described, responded with defensiveness. They experienced the criticism of Apu as an attack on something they loved, as an example of cultural scrutiny being applied to things in a way they found disproportionate. For these viewers, the show's defensive response was appropriate. It was protecting something that deserved protection. Another portion of the audience, including younger viewers and viewers with personal connection to the representation question, found the criticism entirely persuasive and experienced the show's response as evidence that it had become exactly the kind of institution it had always claimed to be satirizing. One more interested in protecting its own legacy than in genuinely reckoning with the harm it had caused. Both responses contain legitimate observations. The show's portrayal of Apu over its long history is not reducible to the accent. There are genuinely thoughtful episodes featuring the character that treat his situation with care and insight, and the harm that the accent caused in social contexts outside the show was real, documented, and not adequately anticipated by the people who created it. Holding both of those things simultaneously requires the kind of intellectual flexibility that public debates about identity and representation rarely encourage. What the Apu situation ultimately revealed about The Simpsons is less about the character specifically and more about the conditions under which the show was made across its history. A writing room that was for decades predominantly white, predominantly male, and predominantly educated at a small collection of elite institutions was going to have blind spots that were structural rather than individual. Those blind spots were not going to be visible from inside the room because the room did not include people for whom the visibility of those blind spots would have been obvious. The problem was not that the writers were bad people or careless artists. The problem was that a room of similar people, however talented, makes similar assumptions about what is and is not worth noticing. And some things that were not noticed caused real harm to real people in ways that accumulated over decades before anyone was in a position to bring it into the room's field of view. The specific timeline of the Apu controversy is worth tracing carefully because the sequence of responses reveals a great deal about how institutions handle criticism when they are more invested in self-protection than in genuine reckoning. Hari Kondabolu first began talking publicly about the problem with Apu in his stand-up work several years before the documentary. He had been raising the question in comedy circles and in interviews for years before he had the platform and the resources to make a documentary about it. The question he was raising was not new. South Asian American comedians and writers had been discussing the Apu character and its effects for as long as the character had been prominent. What changed with the documentary was that the conversation became impossible for people outside those communities to continue ignoring. The show's initial defensive response, through the Lisa fourth wall moment, was followed by a period of approximately 2 years during which the show did not directly address the question again in any substantive way. Episodes continued. Apu continued to appear, though with somewhat reduced prominence. The public conversation continued without any new engagement from the production. When Hank Azaria finally announced his departure from the role in early 2020, the announcement came as part of a broader reckoning that had been building for years. His statement was notably different in character from the show's official responses. Where the show's responses had been defensive or evasive, Azaria's personal statement was specific and honest. He described the process by which he had come to understand the impact of his performance differently than he had previously understood it. He described specific conversations, specific moments of recognition. He made a clear and unambiguous apology. The reception of Azaria's statement was complex. Many people in the South Asian community received it as meaningful and genuine. Some noted that an apology without changed behavior is incomplete, while also acknowledging that in this case the behavior was changing. Some observers expressed frustration that it had taken so long that the conversation Kondabolu was trying to have in 2017 should not have required 3 years and a cultural reckoning of enormous magnitude to produce a response from the person most directly implicated. Kondabolu's own response to Azaria's apology and to their subsequent conversations was notably generous. In a moment that received less attention than the initial controversy, Kondabolu described Azaria as someone who had engaged genuinely with the criticism and had done meaningful personal work to understand the impact of the character. He expressed something close to respect for what Azaria had done, while also noting that the structural questions about representation in entertainment that Apu had illuminated had not been resolved by any individual's apology. Those structural questions remain genuinely unresolved. The composition of The Simpsons writers' room has changed over the decades, becoming more diverse in some respects, though the pace and degree of that change has been a subject of ongoing discussion among people who track these things. The hiring practices that shape who is in the room when characters like Apu are being conceived and written are larger questions that no individual show can resolve on its own, but that every show with cultural influence has some responsibility to grapple with honestly. The legacy of the Apu conversation in the broader entertainment industry is, arguably, more significant than its specific resolution within The Simpsons. The documentary prompted conversations across animation and live-action television about the conditions under which writers' rooms make decisions about representation, about who is and is not present when those decisions are being made, and about what it means to create characters whose portrayal carries representational weight, whether or not the creators intend it to. These conversations have been ongoing since 2017 and have produced some concrete changes in industry practice, though the scope and permanence of those changes is difficult to assess from the outside. What the Apu controversy ultimately produced within The Simpsons is a character who now occupies a much smaller space in the show than he once did, a situation that Kondabolu has said was not exactly what he was hoping for. The absence of Apu from the show does not make the show more representative. It simply removes the specific site of controversy. The question of how American animated television depicts communities that are underrepresented in its creative workforce has not been answered by Apu's departure. It has been deferred, in the specific way that institutional responses to uncomfortable questions often defer rather than resolve. Number Section 6. The Animation Underground and its Complicated Legacy. The world from which The Simpsons emerged was small enough in the late 1980s that the people working in it knew each other, competed with each other, and shared a set of aspirations about what animation could become if anyone was brave enough to find out. Animation as a creative form for adult audiences was not yet a recognized genre. It was an aspiration, a belief held by a small community that the medium was capable of more than Saturday morning cartoons and corporate mascots, and the people who held that belief were willing to work at the margins of the industry to prove it. Matt Groening was part of that world through a specific entry point: alternative publishing. Life in Hell, his comic strip, ran in alternative weekly newspapers across the country beginning in the early 1980s. The alternative press was the natural home for this kind of work. It was a world that valued irreverence, that was comfortable with darkness alongside comedy, that treated the mainstream with the productive contempt of people who believed the mainstream was leaving important things unsaid. When Groening was approached to create animated segments for The Tracy Ullman Show in 1987, he was bringing that sensibility into a new medium, and The Simpsons that resulted was shaped fundamentally by where he came from. John Kricfalusi occupied a different corner of the same small world. Where Groening came from the underground comics tradition, Kricfalusi came from a deep and specific obsession with the history of American studio animation. He had spent years studying the Warner Brothers and Fleischer cartoons of the Golden Era, the 1930s and 40s work that represented the peak of what the American animation industry had done before television, domesticated the form, and stripped away its physical expressiveness. Kricfalusi understood, better than almost anyone working in the medium in the 1980s, what the classic era had possessed and what subsequent decades had lost. He could articulate the specific qualities of a Bob Clampett cartoon or a Max Fleischer film that made them extraordinary, and he had developed strong opinions about why contemporary animation had abandoned those qualities in ways he found genuinely grievous. His career before Ren and Stimpy had included work at studios that were producing the conventional Saturday morning fare he despised, and the creative frustration of that experience gave him the specific intensity that would eventually produce something genuinely new. He was not simply unhappy with what animation had become. He had a precise diagnosis of the problem and a specific vision of the cure, and he pursued that vision with the conviction of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to implement it. When Ren and Stimpy premiered on Nickelodeon in August of 1991, it arrived as a genuinely disorienting viewing experience. Nothing on American animated television at the time looked like it or moved like it or sounded like it. The character designs were fluid and grotesque, in ways that deliberately evoked the classic era while pushing further than the classic era had dared go. The physical comedy was rooted in a specific understanding of how the body could be used for comic effect that derived directly from the Warner Brothers tradition, but was filtered through Kricfalusi's own particular sensibility. The humor ranged from sweetly absurdist to deeply disturbing within the span of a single scene, and the show maintained this tonal range with a control that was itself a form of technical achievement. The animation community's response to Ren and Stimpy was immediate and intense. Young animators who had been frustrated by the creative conservatism of the industry recognized in the show something they had been waiting to see: evidence that what they believed was possible was, in fact, possible. The show's influence on the generation of animators who came up during the 1990s is massive and thoroughly documented. The specific qualities it demonstrated, the physical expressiveness, the willingness to be grotesque, the sense of genuine creative risk in every sequence, these qualities spread through the industry in the years following the show's debut in ways that reshaped what animated television looked and felt like. The production culture at Spumco, the studio Kricfalusi had founded to produce the show, was shaped by his specific vision and his specific personality in ways that created both extraordinary creative output and serious problems. Kricfalusi was a demanding and difficult creative director whose standards were genuinely high and whose methods for enforcing those standards were sometimes damaging to the people who worked for him. Former employees have described a production environment that was chaotic, that operated on schedules that were impossible to meet without enormous personal cost, and that was organized around Kricfalusi's personal vision in a way that left little room for dissenting perspectives. The relationship between Kricfalusi and Nickelodeon deteriorated over the first 2 seasons of the show, as the network grew increasingly concerned about the content he was producing and about the chronic delays in episode delivery. Kricfalusi's willingness to fight for the integrity of his creative vision made him genuinely difficult to manage from a network's perspective. He was not making the compromises that the network needed him to make, and the network was not providing the latitude he felt his work required. The conflict became irresolvable, and in 1992, Kricfalusi was fired from his own show. The show continued without him under different creative leadership, but it was never the same. The circumstances of the BuzzFeed News investigation that published in 2018 are, in the context of this story, the point where everything that had been uncomfortable about Kricfalusi's legacy became something much more serious. 2 women came forward describing relationships they said had begun when they were teenagers and Kricfalusi was decades older. One of the women, Robin Bird, described a relationship that began when she was 16 and he was in his mid-30s. The other described similar experiences. Both provided documentation of communications that they said supported their accounts. Kricfalusi's response acknowledged that he had been involved with Bird, but disputed the characterization of the relationship in ways that Bird and others found inadequate. The response from the animation industry reflected the specific difficulty of processing these revelations when they concern someone who has been genuinely influential to your creative development and your sense of what your medium can be. Kricfalusi had been, for a generation of animators, more than simply a talented filmmaker. He had been the proof that their aspirations about animation's potential were not naive, that the medium could be something extraordinary if someone fought hard enough to make it that way. Learning that this person had, by his own partial admission, behaved in ways that were predatory and harmful toward young women who had been vulnerable to him required processing both the creative reverence and the moral revulsion simultaneously. The Simpsons and Ren and Stimpy are not the same project. They emerged from adjacent creative communities but pursued different goals with different methods. The Simpsons was primarily interested in character and satire. Ren and Stimpy was primarily interested in physical expressiveness and formal experimentation. They shared the conviction that animation deserved to be taken seriously, that it could operate at a level of creative ambition that the industry had largely abandoned, and that making genuinely good animated television required fighting against institutional conservatism with more persistence than most people were willing to sustain. The animation industry that both shows helped reshape is more diverse, more formally ambitious, and more creatively varied than the one into which they were born. The shows that followed them, South Park and Futurama and Adult Swim's programming, and the various streaming animated series that have proliferated in more recent years, operate in a landscape that was shaped in part by the work those 2 shows did in demonstrating that adult animated television could be more than an afterthought. The creative legacy is real and continues to generate genuine artistic achievement. The personal legacy of one of that era's most important figures is something the people who care about the medium have had to reckon with honestly. The work did not stop being significant because of what was revealed about the person who made it. The craft, the specific technical and creative achievements, remain in the historical record exactly as they were before the revelations. What changed is the context in which those achievements are understood, and the relationship that the people who learned from them are able to maintain with that learning. Reckoning with a complicated legacy requires being honest about both its parts. The animation that Kricfalusi made was genuinely extraordinary. The harm that he caused to vulnerable people was genuinely real. Neither of those facts erases the other. Holding both of them simultaneously, without collapsing into either adulation or condemnation, is the honest response to what the record contains. It is also, not coincidentally, the kind of complex and uncomfortable truth that The Simpsons, at its best, was always trying to help its audience understand about the world it inhabited. Section 7. Celebrity feuds, on-screen cameos gone wrong, and the stars who refused. The Simpsons has featured more celebrity guest appearances than any other show in the history of American television. By the time of writing, the show has hosted hundreds of guest performers across its run, encompassing A-list film actors, legendary musicians, prominent athletes, major political figures, Nobel laureates, iconic comedians, and cultural icons from virtually every domain of human achievement. The show developed, particularly in its middle decades, a kind of institutional status as a cultural arbiter that made receiving a Simpsons invitation feel like a form of recognition. To be offered a cameo was to be acknowledged as someone who had achieved a sufficient level of cultural significance to exist, at least briefly, within the same frame as Homer and Bart and Springfield. The process of landing those appearances and managing their aftermath was rarely as smooth as the final product suggests. The story of the show's celebrity relationships is a story of negotiation and occasional mutual incomprehension, and sometimes of guests who departed feeling considerably less warmly about the experience than they had when they arrived. Prince is the most discussed example of a celebrity whose requirements for participation were simply impossible to accommodate. Prince had a reputation across his entire career for attaching specific and sometimes unworkable conditions to any form of collaboration or commercial association. When discussions about a potential Simpsons appearance arose at some point during the show's middle years, his representatives communicated requirements that the production found incompatible with how the show operated. The specific nature of those requirements has not been publicly disclosed in comprehensive detail, but accounts from people connected to the production suggest they centered on a level of creative control over how the character would be portrayed that the show was not willing to grant to any guest performer. The appearance never happened. Prince died in 2016, having never appeared on the show, and his name comes up whenever the show's guest history is discussed, precisely because his absence from it is one of its more striking gaps. The backstory of Michael Jackson's participation in Stark Raving Dad, which we have discussed in the context of its withdrawal, deserves additional attention in the context of celebrity dynamics because it illustrates something important about the specific conditions under which certain performers engaged with the show. Jackson was in 1991 one of the most famous people on Earth. He was also a devoted fan of The Simpsons who approached the production rather than being approached by it. He negotiated the terms of his own involvement with a specificity that reflected his unusual position, so famous that his involvement with any project changed the nature of that project in ways he could not always control. The pseudonym, the deniability, the open secret, all of these were his choices. They were designed to let him be present in something he loved while maintaining a form of distance from the commercial and cultural freight that typically accompanied a Michael Jackson appearance. The episode built around his participation worked, because the production treated the participation as a creative opportunity rather than simply a commercial one. The character has something genuinely interesting to do in the episode. He is not simply present as famous person. He is a figure who helps Homer and Lisa in ways that are emotionally satisfying and that the episode has carefully prepared for. When everything about the episode is done right in this way, the result is something memorable. When a guest appearance is primarily a commercial arrangement, the results tend to feel like exactly that. The Jay Sherman crossover is a counterexample of what can happen when a guest appearance serves institutional interests rather than creative ones. Jay Sherman was the fictional film critic protagonist of The Critic, an animated show created by Al Jean and Mike Reiss after they left The Simpsons. The crossover that brought Sherman into Springfield was arranged through the relationship between the two productions, and it was seen by some within the Simpsons writing team as an endorsement of a competing animated show that served Gene and Reese's interests more clearly than it served the show's interests. Matt Groening expressed discomfort with the episode publicly, which was an unusual acknowledgement of internal disagreement about a specific creative decision. The episode aired, its mixed reception became part of the historical record, and the experience contributed to a more cautious approach to crossover appearances going forward. Dustin Hoffman's appearance in the Season 2 episode Lisa's Substitute is one of the most remarkable in the show's celebrity history, remarkable for the quality of the performance rather than any controversy surrounding it. Hoffman performed under the pseudonym Sam Ettick, an anagram of his name, voicing Mr. Bergstrom, the substitute teacher who becomes an important figure for Lisa. Hoffman brought to the performance a specificity and emotional investment that elevated it beyond what the role required. The episode works as well as it does in part because the voice behind the character is doing something genuinely thoughtful and subtle giving Bergstrom a quality that makes the audience feel his absence after he leaves as clearly as Lisa does. The decision to perform under a pseudonym is interesting as a reflection of Hoffman's ambivalence about the association. The pseudonym let him participate genuinely while maintaining a degree of professional distance. The arrangement produced a performance that is, in retrospect, among the best guest turns in the show's history. Elizabeth Taylor's cameo, in which she voiced Maggie Simpson's first word in the episode Lisa's First Word, is famous less for the performance itself than for the economics surrounding it. Taylor received a fee for the engagement that various industry accounts reported as substantial, in the range of compensation that might accompany a featured film role, for a single word spoken once. The production's justification was that the cultural significance of having someone of Taylor's stature provide the voice for this particular moment was worth the cost. The episode is a very good one, and the decision to end it with Maggie's first word spoken by the most famous actress of a generation produced a moment that has been remembered for 3 decades. Whether the economic logic was sound is a question for the production's accountants. That the creative logic produced something memorable is easier to argue. Kelsey Grammer's recurring participation as Sideshow Bob represents perhaps the most sustained and mutually satisfying celebrity relationship in the show's history. Grammer has voiced the character across dozens of episodes spanning the show's entire run, returning reliably to a character he clearly enjoys inhabiting, bringing to each appearance a theatrical commitment and a quality of operatic villainy that has become one of the show's most beloved recurring pleasures. His willingness to treat the character with full seriousness, to play Sideshow Bob's grandiosity and his failures without ever winking at the audience about the absurdity of the situation, is exactly what makes the character work. The comedy depends on the sincerity of the performance. Grammer has maintained that sincerity across decades of association with the character. Ringo Starr's appearance in Season 2's Brush with Greatness is affectionate toward both the guest and the audience's relationship to his famous past. Starr appears as himself, responding to a fan's long-delayed letter, and the episode handles the joke about his post-Beatles celebrity status with genuine warmth rather than cruelty. Starr was willing to be the subject of gentle satire of his own cultural position, to trust the show to handle that satire kindly, and the episode rewarded that trust with something that was funny without being unkind. The celebrities who decided not to appear are, in some ways, as interesting as those who did. Some performers were uncomfortable with the degree of creative control they would lose over their portrayal once they agreed to participate. The Simpsons satire has always had edges, and for celebrities accustomed to controlling their public image with precision, agreeing to appear in a context where the writer's room would determine how they were depicted required a degree of trust in the production's good faith that not everyone was comfortable extending. The cases where a celebrity arrived expecting one kind of appearance and received another are the most revealing. Several performers came to the recording studio expecting that their cameo would be essentially promotional, that the character would be portrayed admiringly and the jokes would be gentle. When the script proved more satirically pointed than expected, the negotiations over what the performance would ultimately include were sometimes difficult. The show's position, articulated repeatedly by various producers over the years, was that the integrity of the satire required that everyone who appeared be subject to the same willingness to find the comedy in their situation. Celebrities who were unwilling to accept this on some level tended not to have satisfying experiences. The management of all of these celebrity relationships across more than 3 decades has required the show's production team to develop a sophisticated understanding of what different categories of celebrity bring to the experience, and what the show can offer them that serves both parties. When the alignment between what the show needs from a guest and what the guest is willing to give has been good, the results have been among the show's most memorable moments. When the alignment has been poor, the results have ranged from awkward to actively damaging. The show has learned, across hundreds of guest appearances, how to read those alignments. That institutional knowledge is itself a significant asset, one that is harder to quantify than any specific guest's contribution, but more durable than any individual appearance. The mechanics of booking a celebrity for The Simpsons changed substantially across the show's run, in ways that track the show's evolution from cultural phenomenon to established institution. In the early and middle seasons, when the show was at the peak of its cultural relevance, the question of who wanted to be on The Simpsons was answered by essentially everyone. The show had achieved a status that made appearing in it feel like a form of cultural validation. It was the television equivalent of being on the cover of a major magazine. evidence that you had achieved a level of cultural significance that the most culturally significant show in American television was willing to acknowledge. The booking process in those years was characterized by a relative scarcity of available slots and an abundance of interested celebrities, which meant the production had genuine leverage to be selective. They could turn down celebrities who seemed like poor fits or who came with conditions that the production found incompatible with how the show worked. They could prioritize guests whose presence would serve a specific creative purpose rather than simply generating commercial attention. The show's casting decisions during its peak years reflected this leverage, tending toward guests whose participation was motivated by genuine creative interest rather than purely promotional considerations. As the show's cultural position shifted, the dynamics of celebrity booking shifted with it. The show remained a prestige destination by the standards of animated television, but its position in the broader cultural landscape changed as the landscape itself changed. New prestige destinations emerged. The cultural power that had once been concentrated in a relatively small number of broadcast television shows dispersed across cable, streaming, social media, and other platforms. The Simpsons remained significant, but its significance was no longer unique in the way it had been during the years when it was, by common consensus, the most important show on American television. The guests who appeared in the earlier seasons tended to play versions of themselves that the show's writers had thought carefully about. The comedy in those appearances arose from the specific qualities that made each celebrity what they were, the ways their real-world personas and public images could be used to illuminate something about the show's world or the real world it was commenting on. When the show put a specific celebrity in a Springfield context, the joke worked because of what the audience already knew and felt about that person, and the show trusted the audience to bring that knowledge to the viewing experience. The later seasons have been more likely to feature celebrity appearances that function primarily as promotional events, in which the celebrity plays an approximation of themselves, without the kind of specific character work that would require genuine creative engagement on the part of either the writers or the performer. These appearances are professionally executed. They are rarely embarrassing, but they do not generate the specific quality of surprise and recognition that the best early celebrity episodes produced. The musicians who appeared on the show represent a specific category whose history is worth examining separately. Music has always been central to The Simpsons, in ways that sometimes get overlooked in discussions focused on the writing and animation. Danny Elfman's main theme is among the most recognizable pieces of music in the history of American television, and the show has used incidental and featured music throughout its run, with a sophistication that reflects the musical knowledge of specific writers and producers. When musicians appeared as themselves in episodes, the results ranged from the genuinely extraordinary to the competently average. Paul McCartney's appearance in the episode Lisa the Vegetarian from Season 7 is frequently cited as one of the better celebrity episodes in the show's history. McCartney and his then-wife Linda had conditions for the appearance. The episode had to treat Lisa's vegetarianism seriously, rather than as something to be resolved by having her return to eating meat by the episode's end. The show accepted the condition, produced an episode that engaged honestly with Lisa's ethical position, and gave McCartney something to do in the episode that reflected genuine care about the character's situation, rather than simply using his fame as the episode's premise. The Rolling Stones episode, which was written as a showcase for the band's appearance, did not achieve the same balance. The comedy around a band of legendary rock musicians being depicted as elderly men of questionable health has a kind of comedic logic, but it is not the kind of comedy that requires the specific presence of the actual Rolling Stones. The joke would have worked with any aging rock band. The Stones' participation added commercial marquee value without adding creative specificity, and the episode reflects that priority in ways that are visible in comparison to the McCartney episode. Bette Midler's appearance is worth noting as an example of a celebrity who brought genuine investment to a character and a situation that might otherwise have been merely competent. Midler appeared as herself in an episode centered on environmental cleanup, a cause she was genuinely associated with in her public life. The comedy in the episode derives partly from the absurdity of Bette Midler appearing in Springfield at all, but also from Midler's willingness to commit fully to the situation's logic, to treat the episode's fictional reality as genuinely real in the way that the best comedy requires. She was not winking at the audience about the absurdity of her presence. She was in the situation. James Brown's appearance in the episode Bart's Friend Falls in Love is brief but perfectly calibrated. A single joke that requires Brown's specific presence to land, and that earns its laugh through both the specific quality of his delivery and the audience's relationship to what he represents. It is an example of the show using a celebrity not as the center of the episode's commercial value, but as the carrier of a single comic moment that his specific qualities make possible. That economy, the willingness to use famous people for the precise thing their fame and their talent make possible, rather than for their generalized fame, characterizes the show's best celebrity work. The recurring tension between the show's satirical mission and the commercial dynamics of celebrity booking is something the show has occasionally addressed directly. Episodes that feature celebrities tend to be among the more commercially promoted episodes of any given season. They drive ratings, generate media coverage, and provide marketing fodder that benefits both the show and the celebrity being featured. This commercial symbiosis creates pressure on the creative dynamic of the appearance. The celebrity is less likely to be treated with the satirical bite that the show at its best applied equally to everyone, because the relationship is commercial as well as creative, and biting the hand that generates mutual publicity is something that commercial relationships discourage. The greatest celebrity appearances on The Simpsons managed to navigate this tension by finding something genuinely funny and specific in the celebrity's presence without crossing into territory that would make the commercial relationship untenable. The worst appearances resolve the tension by eliminating one of its terms, either by pulling the satirical punches to the point of meaninglessness, or by declining to find anything genuinely specific in the celebrity's presence. The range between these extremes represents most of the show's several hundred celebrity episodes, and navigating that range has been one of the recurring creative challenges of the show's production. The fact that essentially everyone who was asked to appear on The Simpsons said yes, across the show's entire run and including people who were generally protective of their public images and their commercial associations, tells you something about the show's cultural standing that no award statistic or ratings number can convey. The Simpsons was, for a significant period of its history, one of the things you did if you were culturally significant in American life. It was the program that took you seriously enough to include you and trusted you to take it seriously enough to participate. That specific form of mutual trust between the show and the culture it inhabited is one of the things that made the peak years extraordinary, and one of the things that the later years could not fully replicate once the cultural context that supported it had changed. Number Section 8. The long decline. Who is really responsible? The question of when The Simpsons went bad is one of the most reliably generative debates in American pop culture. It is an argument that has been conducted continuously for approximately 25 years, across every available medium, between people who were there when it happened and people who have only ever seen the before and after in retrospect. It is an argument with passionate participants on multiple sides, each side defending a periodization with evidence, and it is an argument that has not reached consensus because the underlying question does not yield to consensus. What makes the debate remarkable is its longevity. A show that stopped being consistently great at some point in the late 1990s has generated more sustained critical and fan engagement around the question of its decline than most shows generate around the question of their peak. This is a tribute to what the peak was. The Simpsons at its best was genuinely extraordinary television, and the fall from that level of achievement is felt as a loss proportionate to the magnitude of what was lost. The periodization question is the first area of disagreement. Different factions of the show's observers mark the beginning of the decline at different points. The most common marker is the transition to Mike Scully's tenure as showrunner beginning with Season 9. A smaller faction argues that the decline began earlier, with changes in the writing staff that predated Scully's arrival. Another group maintains that the show was still producing genuinely excellent television into Seasons 9 and 10, and that the real decline came later, as the Al Jean era progressed and specific writers who had been responsible for its most ambitious output departed. The episode that appears most consistently as a candidate for the precise moment of transition is The Principal and the Pauper. Not because everyone agrees it is the worst episode the show ever produced, but because it represents something specific and legible, a decision that many people felt violated something fundamental about the show's relationship to its own characters. And that signaled a willingness to sacrifice character integrity for a premise the production found clever. When a show as sophisticated as The Simpsons makes a decision like that and then does not course-correct visibly, it is announcing something about its creative priorities that the audience hears. The structural factors that contributed to the decline are often underweighted in discussions that focus primarily on creative decisions. Long-running television shows face structural constraints that become more binding with each passing season, and those constraints are independent of who is running the production or how talented the writers are. The floating timeline creates a specific version of the structural problem. Characters who cannot change, who cannot permanently learn from their experiences, who cannot have their relationships altered in ways that the following season will acknowledge, are constrained to stories that are, by definition, variations on a limited set of themes. The show has been mining those themes for more than 36 years. The themes are not thin. They sustained 8 seasons of extraordinary television, which suggests genuine depth, but they have limits. The specific kinds of stories the show can tell with these characters narrow over time in ways that are real and increasingly visible. The commercial factors are perhaps the most important and the least discussed. The Simpsons generates enormous revenue for Fox, for Disney, for the production entities that hold equity in the franchise, and for the various downstream commercial operations that depend on the franchise's continued cultural relevance. That revenue creates a structural pressure to keep producing the show regardless of whether the creative conditions exist for production at the highest level. A show that could theoretically conclude with a finale that honored its legacy instead continues season after season because the financial ecosystem surrounding it has built dependencies on continuation that would be costly to disrupt. The question of whether any given season's output is as good as it could be becomes secondary to the question of whether the franchise continues to exist as a revenue-generating entity. Those are different questions with different answers, and the commercial one has consistently prevailed. The creative depletion factor is real and worth taking seriously as a phenomenon rather than dismissing as an excuse. Sustaining genuine creative novelty across 800-plus episodes of the same characters in the same setting is an undertaking without meaningful precedent. The writers who joined the show in its later seasons have been tasked with an assignment that is genuinely harder than the assignment faced by their predecessors. They must produce something that feels worthwhile in comparison to a catalog of work that, at its best, is genuinely exceptional. Using characters and settings that have been thoroughly established by that catalog, finding things to say that the show has not already said more freshly in an earlier season. The network's role in the show's creative trajectory deserves direct examination as well. Fox has not been a neutral platform for the show. It has been an active participant in shaping it, through the notes it provides, the content it requires modification of, the advertiser relationships it protects, and the corporate priorities it communicates to the production. The creative latitude that Fox provided in the show's early seasons was extraordinary by the standards of network television. As the show became commercially indispensable, the nature of the network's relationship to the production changed. Notes became more regular. Concerns about specific content became more frequently communicated. The pressure to produce television that would not create problems with advertisers or generate controversy became more consistently present. Former writers who have described the note process in any detail tend to characterize it as one of the more draining aspects of their experience. Not because the notes were always wrong, though they were often wrong, but because engaging with them required operating in a mode fundamentally different from the mode required to make good television. Good television requires creative risk, requires the willingness to commit to a premise that might not work, requires a tolerance for uncertainty about whether what you are making is actually any good. The note process tends to push in the opposite direction, toward safety, toward the defensible, toward the version of the episode that will attract the least negative attention from the largest number of stakeholders. Bill Oakley, who co-ran the show during seasons 7 and 8 and is widely regarded as having presided over its creative apex, has spoken in interviews with notable directness about the differences between the show he made and the show it subsequently became. He has pointed specifically to the willingness of the early writers' room to take emotional risks, to build episodes toward moments of genuine feeling that the comedy could not undo. The episode where Homer discovers his mother is alive, the episode where Lisa's substitute teacher leaves and she breaks down in the parking lot, these are comedies that earned their emotional conclusions. They work because the show respected the intelligence of its audience enough to let the feelings land without undercutting them. The later show, by contrast, has been more likely to use a comedic cutaway to escape an emotional moment before it can fully register, more likely to reset a character's emotional development within the same episode, more likely to treat the comedy and the feeling as mutually exclusive rather than mutually dependent. This is not universally true of the post-Golden Age episodes. There are moments of genuine feeling throughout the show's later seasons, but they are less frequent and less structurally central to the episodes that contain them. Who, then, is responsible for the decline? The honest answer is that responsibility is distributed across many parties in ways that resist clean allocation. The showrunners who made specific choices that moved the show away from its most distinctive qualities are responsible for those choices, even when each individual choice was defensible in the context in which it was made. The network that applied commercial pressure that shaped the creative environment is responsible for that pressure, even when the specific concerns being communicated were legitimate from a commercial standpoint. The writers who departed and took specific sensibilities with them are responsible for their departures, even when those departures were entirely justified. The audience that continued watching long after the peak had passed, signaling through their continued engagement that the decline had no commercial cost, is responsible for that signal, even when watching out of habit and affection rather than satisfaction. And the show's structural constraints are responsible for the creative conditions they create, even when those conditions are the same ones that allowed the show to exist long enough to create the extraordinary work of its peak years. The features that enabled the achievement and the features that enabled the decline are, to a large degree, the same features. They are inseparable aspects of what The Simpsons is. And what The Simpsons is, for better and for worse, is the longest-running animated television program in history, sustained across decades by a combination of genuine creative ambition and institutional inertia, and capable at its best of something that has not quite been replicated before or since. There is a specific kind of grief that longtime Simpsons fans describe when they talk about the show's decline, and it is worth taking that grief seriously rather than dismissing it as nostalgia or as an inevitable byproduct of aging. The grief is specific. It is not simply that the show has changed, because all long-running things change, and change is not inherently loss. It is that specific qualities that felt essential to the show's identity, qualities that were not superficial, stylistic choices, but fundamental approaches to what the show was trying to do and how it was trying to do it, seem to have been lost rather than evolved. The most commonly cited of these qualities is what fans call emotional honesty. The early Simpsons was willing to put its characters in situations of genuine emotional weight and let those situations land without deflecting. The episode where Homer discovers his mother is alive and then has to say goodbye to her a second time is not handled as a comedy. The comedy exists in the episode. It does its job, but it does not prevent the emotional truth of the situation from being felt. The show holds both things at once, the joke and the feeling, without letting either one undo the other. That is a difficult balance to maintain, and the early show maintained it consistently in ways that made it genuinely extraordinary. What replaced that balance in the later years is a tendency toward emotional deflection, toward the comedic cutaway or the tonal reset that prevents a feeling from fully developing before the episode moves on. This tendency is not uniform. There are episodes in the show's later seasons that achieve genuine emotional weight. But as a pattern of behavior, the later show is less willing to sit with an uncomfortable feeling than the earlier show was. And the effect of this shift on the viewer's engagement with the characters is cumulative. When feelings are consistently prevented from landing, the characters become less real. The situations become less urgent. The investment the audience brings to each episode decreases. The seasonal structure of the show and how the writer's room functions within it is relevant here. Television comedy writers' rooms operate under enormous time pressure. The volume of material that must be produced within a season's production schedule leaves limited room for the kind of sustained development of an emotional arc that the best early episodes required. The episodes that most successfully integrated comedy and genuine feeling were the products of writers who had both the instinct to see the emotional possibility in a situation and the time and support to develop that possibility fully. As the production calendar has become more demanding and the creative turnover in the room more regular, the conditions for producing that kind of episode have become harder to maintain. The default towards safer comedy, towards situations that are reliably funny without requiring the emotional investment that the great episodes demanded, is partly a response to those conditions. It is not simply laziness or declining ambition. It is the predictable result of a system that does not always create the conditions for the most demanding kind of creative work. The international comparison is instructive. British television, which operates on much shorter seasonal runs, often of 6 or fewer episodes, has demonstrated repeatedly that long-term character development and sustained emotional arcs are possible in comedy when the production structure creates time for them. American network television's standard of 22-episode seasons creates pressures that British television does not face, and those pressures shape the kind of comedy it is possible to produce within them. The Simpsons has operated within American network television's structural constraints throughout its run, and the shape of its output reflects those constraints in ways that are often invisible because they are so fundamental to the conditions of production. The question of what a truly honest accounting of The Simpsons' decline would look like requires acknowledging that the show was, during its best years, genuinely difficult to make. The episodes that are most celebrated required specific combinations of talent, time, creative leadership, and institutional support that are not reliably reproducible. The people who made those episodes were working at the edge of their abilities in ways that could not be sustained indefinitely. Some of them burned out, some moved on. Some produced brilliant work and then found that the specific circumstances that enabled it had changed in ways they could not reverse. The decline of The Simpsons is, in part, the story of what happens when exceptional creative conditions do not or cannot persist. The machine keeps running, the episodes keep coming, the commercial imperatives are met, but the specific spark that made the best episodes extraordinary, the quality that made audiences feel they were watching something that understood them and cared about what it was trying to say, that quality is harder to sustain than it is to produce in the first place. It requires not just talent but the right kind of talent, in the right kind of conditions at the right moment. And those moments, as the history of The Simpsons demonstrates, do not last forever. Section 9. The merchandise empire, the dark licensing deals, and the money nobody talks about. There is a version of The Simpsons that has nothing to do with television. It does not air on Sunday nights. It does not require writers or voice actors or animators. It requires only the yellow faces, the specific font, the silhouette of Homer mid-stride, the image of Bart on a skateboard. This version of The Simpsons generates hundreds of millions of dollars every year, and it is the version of the franchise that most people on Earth have encountered without ever sitting down to watch a single episode. The merchandising operation that grew up around The Simpsons in the early 1990s was, at the time of its peak, one of the most successful in the history of American entertainment. It was also, in its early phases, one of the most chaotic and least strategically managed, a cash rush that produced a sprawling inventory of licensed products, some of which were well conceived and some of which were simply attempts to put a recognizable image on something and sell it before the cultural moment passed. The first wave of Simpsons merchandise arrived in 1990, almost simultaneously with the show's debut as a primetime series. Fox moved quickly to capitalize on the show's immediate and unexpected popularity, licensing the characters to manufacturers of clothing, toys, school supplies, novelty items, and a range of other consumer products with a speed that suggested commercial confidence but not necessarily quality control. The result was a flood of product that included some genuinely desirable items, alongside a significant amount of material that was cheaply made, poorly conceived, and that traded entirely on name recognition rather than on any particular merit as a product. The Bart Simpson t-shirt phenomenon of 1990 is worth dwelling on because it tells a specific and instructive story about how a cultural moment can be commercially exploited in ways that produce both enormous revenue, significant reputational cost. Within months of the show's debut, Bart Simpson's image appeared on t-shirts being sold by street vendors, in mall stores, in every retail context that could accommodate a simple garment with a printed image. Many of these shirts were unlicensed, produced by manufacturers who had simply appropriated the character's image without permission. Others were officially licensed but produced under such minimal quality standards that the distinction barely mattered in terms of the finished product. The specific graphic that became the period's defining cultural artifact was the one that showed Bart with the slogan describing him as an underachiever and proud of it. This design appeared on millions of shirts. It was worn by students across the country, became the subject of school dress code battles in districts that banned it as a message promoting a negative academic attitude, and generated the kind of free publicity that no commercial campaign could have purchased. The controversy about whether the shirt was appropriate for school breathlessly reported by local news programs across the country, made the image more ubiquitous than it might otherwise have been. Banning something, as anyone who has spent time around adolescents knows, is an extremely effective way of making it desirable. Fox received licensing revenues from the officially licensed shirts. The unlicensed versions generated nothing for the rights holders, but contributed to the saturation of the image in public consciousness in ways that benefited the brand overall, a complicated commercial situation in which the intellectual property violation was simultaneously damaging to the specific transaction and helpful to the broader commercial enterprise. The legal effort to suppress the unlicensed merchandise was real but ultimately insufficient to prevent what had essentially become a cultural phenomenon too large and too distributed to be controlled through normal legal mechanisms. The toy line that emerged in the early 1990s represents a different kind of commercial story. Playmates Toys acquired the Simpsons license and produced an extensive range of action figures, playsets, and related merchandise that was, by the standards of licensed television merchandise, reasonably well made and commercially significant. The Simpsons toy line achieved something that not every licensed property manages. The products were bought and kept, not just given as gifts and discarded. Adults collected them alongside children. The figures captured something of the show's visual style, with enough fidelity that they felt like genuine representations of the characters rather than generic approximations. The video game licensing is a more complicated chapter. The Simpsons has been associated with dozens of video game titles across its long history, produced by various developers for various platforms, under licensing arrangements that prioritize the commercial opportunity of the platform moment over any consistent standard of quality or creative fidelity. The games range from genuinely good, particularly the arcade game produced by Konami in 1991, which remains fondly remembered for its multiplayer brawler design and its faithful visual rendering of the show's characters, to aggressively mediocre to actively bad. The Simpsons Wrestling, released for the PlayStation in 2000, achieved a specific kind of gaming infamy, reviewed so poorly that it became an exemplar of how not to make a licensed title. The Konami arcade game deserves particular attention, because it represents a case where the licensing arrangement produced something that worked on its own merits as a piece of entertainment, rather than simply existing as a vehicle for brand recognition. The game was developed during the show's first peak of cultural saturation, when the characters were fresh enough that putting them in an arcade brawler setting felt creative rather than opportunistic. The game's visuals captured the show's color palette and character designs with a fidelity that was impressive for the hardware of the time. The 4-player cooperative structure was genuinely enjoyable. The game was a commercial success in arcades across the world and has retained a devoted following decades later. It is one of the few licensed games of its era that holds up when revisited. The Simpsons arcade game also illustrates one of the recurring tensions in the franchise's commercial history: the gap between the quality of the flagship product, which is excellent, and the quality of the licensed extensions of that product, which is highly variable and often poor. The show has consistently been one of the best things on American television. The products associated with the show have consistently ranged from excellent to abysmal, depending on which developer or manufacturer held the license at any given time and what level of care they chose to invest in their product. Fox's licensing operation has historically been more focused on the volume of licensing deals than on the quality standards applied to each one. The theme park relationship between The Simpsons and Universal Studios deserves examination as a specific case study in how a franchise's commercial extension into physical space can both enhance and complicate its cultural identity. The Simpsons ride opened at Universal Studios Florida in 2008, replacing the Back to the Future ride at the park's Hollywood Studios location and at its Florida park. The ride and the associated Springfield area, which was subsequently built out into a full-themed zone featuring restaurants, shops, and other attractions, represent one of the most financially significant investments in the Simpsons brand outside of the show itself. The Universal agreement gave the franchise a physical presence that television cannot provide. Visitors could walk through a version of Springfield, eat at a version of Krusty Burger, drink at Moe's Tavern. The themed area is designed with the kind of affectionate specificity that communicates genuine investment in the source material. The references are dense and knowing. The design choices reflect an understanding of the show that goes beyond surface familiarity. For devoted fans, a visit to the Springfield area at Universal is a form of engagement with the fictional world that television cannot replicate. It is also, like all theme park experiences, a transaction. The Springfield you walk through is a commercial environment designed to extract revenue from people who love the thing it represents. The Krusty Burger serves real food at theme park prices. The souvenirs are priced at a level that requires either genuine financial commitment or selective restraint. The experience of being inside a favorite fictional world is real, and the fact that it is commercially mediated does not make the experience less meaningful to the people having it. But the commercial structure shapes the experience in ways that are worth being honest about. The Disney acquisition of Fox in 2019 created a new layer of complexity in the Simpsons commercial operation. Disney is the most sophisticated licensing operation in the history of entertainment. Its management of intellectual property assets is characterized by a degree of strategic control and long-term planning that Fox's historically more ad hoc approach to the Simpsons license did not match. The integration of The Simpsons into the Disney commercial ecosystem has included the launch of the show on Disney's streaming platform, which has become the primary way that many younger viewers access the show's back catalog. The streaming arrangement also produced one of the funnier commercial controversies in recent Simpsons history. When the show's catalog was initially made available on Disney+, episodes were presented in a widescreen format that cropped the original 4:3 aspect ratio. The cropping, which was presumably intended to make the content look more contemporary on widescreen displays, cut off visual jokes that had been composed for the original format, jokes placed in the corners of the frame or at the edges of scenes that were simply no longer visible in the modified presentation. Fan reaction was swift and pointed. The issues were documented with specific examples, episodes, and timestamps where the cropping had removed the punchline of a visual gag. Disney restored the original aspect ratio option in response, offering viewers the choice between formats. It was a small episode in the franchise's commercial history, but it illustrated something important. The custodianship of The Simpsons archive requires understanding what the show actually is, and what it actually is was developed with specific compositional assumptions that cannot be overridden without cost. The broader question of what The Simpsons commercial empire has done to the show's cultural identity is one that has no clean answer. Commercial success enabled the production. The revenue from merchandise and licensing and syndication and advertising financed the writer's room and the animation production and the elaborate machinery of a network television series. Without the commercial success, none of the art would have been possible. The Simpsons could not have been made on a shoestring. Its specific ambitions required resources. But the commercial success also created pressures on the art that shaped it in ways that are not always visible but are real. The franchise became too valuable to risk, which made it harder to take the specific creative risks that had made it valuable in the first place. The characters became too commercially embedded to let age or change or reach conclusions, because aging and changing and concluding would have disrupted the merchandise stream. The show became, in part, a content engine whose primary function was to maintain the cultural relevance of a brand. And a content engine is a different thing from a creative enterprise, even when the content it produces is frequently excellent. The people who make The Simpsons have always understood this tension. You can hear it in their public statements, in the way they describe the show's longevity with a pride that is genuine but not entirely uncomplicated. They know what they made. They also know what it became. And they have spent their careers navigating the gap between those two things, trying to keep the creative enterprise alive inside the commercial one, producing something worth watching inside a machine designed to produce something worth selling. The history of The Simpsons on video games is a journey through the full spectrum of what licensed entertainment products can be, from genuinely excellent to memorably terrible, with most of the catalog landing somewhere in the broad and undistinguished middle. The license was commercially attractive enough that developers competed for it across multiple console generations, and the results of those competitions tell a story about the relationship between creative integrity and commercial velocity that applies far beyond gaming. The Konami arcade game from 1991 deserves examination as a specific case where the commercial and creative interests of a licensed product aligned unusually well. Konami was, at the time, one of the most technically accomplished arcade developers in the world. Their work on games like Contra and Castlevania had demonstrated that they understood how to make action games with a physical clarity and responsiveness that made them rewarding to play independent of any intellectual property they were using. When they applied that understanding to The Simpsons property, They produced something that worked as a game on its own terms rather than simply as a vessel for recognizable characters. The choice to make a cooperative brawler, a genre that Konami had already mastered with their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game, was well matched to both the property and the genre's social dynamics. Playing the game with friends, each person playing a different family member, produced a social experience that reinforced the show's core themes about family and togetherness in a way that was genuinely clever rather than superficially thematic. The game understood what made the show appealing and found a way to translate that appeal into an interactive form that preserved something of its spirit. The subsequent decades of Simpsons gaming produced little that matched this achievement. The transition from arcades to home consoles created different commercial pressures and different development contexts, and the results reflected those pressures. Games were made quickly to capitalize on the property's ongoing cultural relevance. Quality control was applied unevenly. The characters were present in the games in the visual sense of looking more or less like themselves, but the specific qualities that made those characters interesting were often absent from the gameplay that surrounded them. The Simpsons Road Rage, released in 2001 for PlayStation 2 and Xbox, was a game that attempted to leverage the property's existing character roster and settings to differentiate a product that was functionally a clone of a more popular game. The strategy was commercially defensible but creatively thin. The game received criticism that acknowledged the presence of the characters and the voice actors, while noting that the presence of recognizable elements was insufficient to make the game worth playing on its own merits. Hit and Run, released in 2003, is the game that Simpsons fans most consistently identify as the best home console Simpsons game. The comparison is not entirely flattering, because the game's success is substantially attributable to the fact that its competitors for the title are not strong. But Hit and Run genuinely does some things well. It captures something of the show's visual aesthetic in a three-dimensional environment with more fidelity than most previous Simpsons games had achieved. It uses the voice cast for an extended amount of dialogue. It creates a sense of Springfield as an environment that can be explored rather than simply as a backdrop for gameplay. These are achievements, even if the game does not rise to the level of something that would be worth playing independent of affection for the source material. The mobile gaming dimension of The Simpsons' commercial history includes the remarkably successful Springfield building game, known in its final form as The Simpsons Tapped Out, which operated as a live service game for approximately a decade before being discontinued. The game's premise, in which players rebuild Springfield after Homer destroys it in a nuclear accident, that is itself a satirical commentary on exactly the kind of workplace incompetence the show had always depicted, was well suited to the specific mechanics of mobile building games. Players could collect characters, construct buildings, complete quests, and participate in seasonal events that kept the game topical relative to whatever the show was doing at any given moment. At its peak, Tapped Out was generating significant annual revenue and maintaining an active player base of millions. The game's connection to the show was deeper than most licensed mobile games managed, partly because the seasonal events frequently referenced recent episodes and partly because the core joke of the premise, Homer's incompetence creating a catastrophe that players helped fix, maintained a satirical quality that felt consistent with the show's sensibility. The game's eventual discontinuation in 2023 produced genuine grief among its player base, which had maintained the game as a form of ongoing creative expression and social connection for years. The merchandise operations relationship to the show's creative output is complex in a specific way that deserves direct examination. The merchandise exists because people love the show. It allows them to carry something of that love into their everyday lives. A Homer Simpson coffee mug on someone's desk is not simply a commercial transaction. It is a declaration of affiliation, an expression of the relationship that person has to a show that has meant something to them. The commercial and the emotional are inseparable in ways that make the merchandise operation not simply a revenue stream but a form of cultural infrastructure. What the merchandise operation also does in ways that are less comfortable to examine is contribute to the conditions that make it commercially impossible to end the show. Every person who buys a Bart Simpson t-shirt or a Simpsons phone case is participating in a commercial ecosystem that creates pressure to maintain the franchise's active cultural presence. The merchandise generates revenue regardless of whether the current seasons of the show are good, regardless of whether the production is generating creative work that the people making it are proud of, regardless of the assessment that any honest observer would make of the show's current quality relative to its historical peak. This is not an argument against merchandise. It is an observation about how commercial infrastructure shapes creative decisions in ways that are largely invisible to the consumers who participate in it. The people who buy Simpsons merchandise are expressing genuine affection. The people who make decisions about the show's continuation are responding to commercial signals that include the revenue from that merchandise. The connection between those two things is real and consequential. The international dimension of the franchise's commercial operation is genuinely staggering in its scale. The Simpsons is one of the most widely recognized cultural products in the world, distributed in more than 100 countries and available in dozens of languages. The specific qualities of the show that translate across cultural contexts are not entirely the same as the qualities that make it excellent. The satire of specifically American institutions, the specific texture of middle-class American family life, the references to American popular culture that are central to many of the show's best jokes, these do not travel identically across cultural boundaries. What does travel is the family. The specific dynamic between Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie is legible across cultural contexts in ways that the cultural specificity of the comedy sometimes is not. The family's essential relationships, the love that coexists with dysfunction, the patience that coexists with frustration, the loyalty that coexists with conflict, these are not specifically American, and audiences around the world have recognized themselves in them in ways that have made the franchise commercially successful across boundaries that many American cultural products cannot fully cross. Section 10. Springfield Forever. Why The Simpsons Can Never End, and What Happens If It Does. At some point, The Simpsons will end. This is a statement of certainty rather than prediction, because everything ends, including things that appear to have transcended the normal rules of cultural temporality. The sun will eventually expand and consume the inner planets. The universe will eventually reach a state of maximum entropy. The Simpsons will eventually air its final episode. These things are equally certain, though their timescales differ by several orders of magnitude. The question of how and when and under what circumstances the show will finally conclude is one that the people closest to it have addressed with varying degrees of directness over the years. The answers they give reveal a great deal about what The Simpsons has become. Not just a television show, but an institution, a cultural landmark, a commercial entity whose continued existence is entangled with so many other interests and dependencies that its ending would not be simply an ending but an event with widespread consequence. The show has been declared, by various commentators, to be in its final season at least a dozen times across its run. Every contract renegotiation, every cast near departure, every period of significant ratings decline has generated a wave of reporting about whether this would be the thing that finally ended it. None of those endings materialized. The contract renegotiations resolved. The cast stayed. The ratings stabilized at levels that were low by the show's historical standards but acceptable by the standards of the contemporary broadcast landscape. The Simpsons continued. The reason it has continued despite decades of predictions about its conclusion is institutional rather than artistic. The franchise is worth too much to allow to conclude on its own terms. The merchandise operation generates revenue that does not depend on new episodes, but is substantially supported by the franchise's continued cultural presence. A Simpsons that is actively in production, that is producing new episodes and receiving the promotional attention that comes with new episodes, is a more commercially active cultural asset than a Simpsons that exists only as a catalog. The difference in licensing value between an active franchise and an archived one is significant, and the people who hold the financial stakes in the franchise are aware of it. This creates a specific dilemma for the show's producers and writers. They are producing a show whose continued existence is driven more by commercial logic than by creative necessity. They know this. The public record contains many statements from people connected to the production that, read carefully, acknowledge this in terms that are cautious but honest. Al Jean has described the challenge of maintaining creative standards across a production of this scale and duration with a candor that makes clear he understands the structural constraints under which he is operating. Matt Groening has spoken about his relationship to the show in terms that suggest genuine ambivalence about its longevity, alongside genuine pride in what it has been. The specific question of what a finale would look like, if one were ever actually produced, is one that the show has addressed in a kind of extended, indirect fashion across multiple episodes and many years. The flash-forward episodes that project characters into possible futures are, among other things, rehearsals for a conclusion that the show cannot actually commit to. They let the writers imagine an end without having to execute one. Lisa grows up and becomes remarkable in some way. Bart grows up and achieves something or fails at something in a way that feels true to his character. Homer and Marge are still together, still arguing, still choosing each other against all evidence that this is a good idea. The family survives into the future. The structure holds. The challenge of a real finale would be more demanding than any of these rehearsals. A real finale would have to do what the flash-forward episodes are explicitly exempted from doing. It would have to make choices. It would have to commit to a version of the future rather than sketching several. It would have to decide what the story of the Simpson family was ultimately about, what it meant to follow them for 36 or 40 or however many seasons it ends up being, and it would have to produce a conclusion that felt proportionate to that meaning. The precedent set by other long-running American comedies is not encouraging in this regard. The endings of beloved long-running comedies are, as a category, among the most difficult things in television to get right. The MASH finale produced something genuinely extraordinary, a conclusion that honored the weight of what the show had accumulated across its run. Seinfeld produced a finale that was almost universally experienced as a disappointment, a conclusion that felt like a repudiation of what the show had been rather than a culmination of it. These are the poles. Most finales land somewhere between them, and most fail in some specific respect to fully satisfy the expectations that decades of investment have created. For The Simpsons, the stakes of getting a finale wrong would be extraordinarily high because the show has an unusually devoted relationship with its audience. The people who love The Simpsons love it in a way that is specifically entangled with their own biographical timelines. They were children when the show began. They grew up alongside it. Their memories of watching it are memories of specific periods of their own lives, associated with places and people and emotional states that the show itself did not create, but that surrounded it. A finale that failed to honor this relationship would not just be bad television. It would feel like a betrayal of something personal. The conversation about what the show owes its audience is one the show itself has been having for years, mostly sideways, in the gaps between episodes and in the meta-commentary it occasionally allows itself. The show is aware that it exists in a complicated relationship with the people who watch it. It knows that many of those people believe the show's best years are behind it. It knows that the argument about when the show should have ended is one that has been running for as long as the show has been running, past the point where its most devoted advocates would have preferred it to stop. And it continues anyway, partly from inertia, partly from commercial pressure, and partly, you sometimes sense, from a genuine belief on the part of the people making it that there are still things worth saying inside this particular fictional world. The show has also had to reckon with the question of its own cultural legacy in real time, which is an unusual position for any creative enterprise. Most works of art are assessed after they conclude. The Simpsons is being assessed continuously, while it is still being made, compared to its own earlier self, in ways that would be unfair to almost any other creative enterprise, and that The Simpsons invites through the sheer scale of its historical output. Every new episode exists in the shadow of the 700-plus episodes that preceded it, and the comparison is rarely flattering to the new one. What will happen when it ends? The merchandising will continue. The themed park area at Universal will remain. The streaming catalog will generate revenue for as long as streaming platforms exist and people choose to watch it. Blinky the three-eyed fish will live on mugs and t-shirts. Homer will continue to fall backward into hedges and screensavers and phone cases and decorative items of every description. The characters will outlive the show in commercial form, as they have already outlived the show in relevance for many members of its audience. The cultural conversation about The Simpsons will continue as well, possibly intensify. The show has generated enough critical and academic attention that the body of analysis surrounding it is already substantial, and the conclusion of the show would likely produce a wave of retrospective examination that the ongoing nature of the production has made more difficult. When you can always watch a new episode, the temptation to assess the whole is lower. When the whole is complete and fixed, the assessment becomes both more urgent and more possible. The honest answer to why The Simpsons cannot end right now is that too many things depend on it continuing. Not just the commercial things, though those are real and significant, The show represents something to the people who make it that is not easily separable from the institutional identity it has given them. Al Jean has spent more of his career running The Simpsons than he has spent doing anything else. The cast members have spent decades inhabiting these characters. The production staff have built their professional identities around this enterprise. The ending of The Simpsons would be, for the people most deeply involved with it, a conclusion not just of a show but of the central organizing commitment of their working lives. That is not a trivial thing. And it is, alongside the commercial pressures and the institutional inertia and the ongoing audience that keeps tuning in, one of the real reasons the show continues. The people making it are not ready to stop. Not because they are not aware that it has changed, not because they cannot see the gap between what it is and what it was, but because continuing means that the thing they gave their professional lives to is still alive. An ending means deciding that it is finished. The floating timeline, the perpetual present, the children who never age, all of this is often analyzed as a function of commercial logic or narrative convenience. But it is also, at some level, a projection of the psychological reality of the people who make the show. They cannot let the characters age because aging leads to ending. They cannot let the story conclude because conclusion means loss. The Springfield that Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie inhabit, suspended in its impossible eternal present, is also the Springfield that the show's creators inhabit. A world where the thing they made stays alive, where the family never changes, where the credits always roll and everything resets, and next Sunday the lights come on in the Simpson house on Evergreen Terrace, and Homer comes home from work and Bart does something stupid and Lisa plays her saxophone and Maggie stares at something with those enormous eyes. It will end. One day it will end. But not yet, because Springfield is still there, and the family is still inside it. And somewhere in a hospital bed, a man is still dreaming about the people he loves, and as long as he keeps dreaming, they stay exactly as they were. His children, his wife, his home, preserved, perfect, permanent. In the only way that anything is ever permanent, which is that we refuse to let it go. The Simpsons has, across its run, produced several episodes that can be read as reflections on its own potential ending, and examining them collectively reveals something about the show's unconscious relationship to the idea of conclusion. The episode Lisa's Wedding from Season 6 shows the Simpson family 20 years in the future. Lisa is engaged to be married to an Englishman. Bart has become a demolitions worker. Homer and Marge are still together, still arguing, still fundamentally the same people they have always been, except that they are older and the world around them has changed. The episode is generous and warm. It imagines a future for the family without sentimentalizing that future, and it does not flinch from the specific ways in which the passage of time has changed everyone while leaving the essential relationships intact. That future was imagined in 1995. It has been almost 30 years since then, and the real family has not aged into the future. Lisa's wedding depicted. They remain frozen at the ages they occupied when the episode aired. The future the show imagined for them has come and gone in real time, while the characters stood still. There is something melancholy about this that the show has occasionally acknowledged, through moments where it lets itself think about what it would mean for these people to actually grow old, and then retreats from the thought before it becomes something the show cannot step back from. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, was positioned at the time of its release as a potential ending. It was not designed as a definitive conclusion, but the scale of its ambition and the way it was marketed suggested that the production was aware it might function as one if audiences received it that way. The film performed extraordinarily well commercially, grossing nearly $530 million against a production budget of approximately $75 million. By any measure, it was a success. And its success ensured that the show would continue, because a franchise that can generate that kind of theatrical revenue has demonstrated a commercial vitality that no one with a financial stake in the outcome would want to interrupt. The question of a second theatrical film has been discussed publicly on several occasions without producing a definitive answer. Various members of the production and cast have expressed interest in the possibility. The challenge is that the conditions that made the first film a commercial event, rather than merely a theatrical curiosity, were partly a function of timing. The Simpsons movie arrived at a moment when the franchise's cultural relevance was still high enough that its theatrical debut felt like a genuine occasion. A second film would arrive in a different cultural context, one in which the franchise's standing has changed. Whether it could replicate the commercial performance of the first film is an open question that the people with the most at stake have been cautious about answering definitively. The streaming era has created new possibilities and new pressures for the franchise simultaneously. The availability of the complete back catalog on Disney Plus has introduced the show to audiences who are too young to have encountered it during its original run, and some of these new viewers have developed a relationship to the earlier seasons that mirrors the relationship older fans developed during the show's cultural peak. The show has found a new generation of devoted viewers even as its current output receives more muted critical attention. This is a counterintuitive dynamic that the show's producers have noted with what sounds like genuine gratitude. It also means that the ending of the show, when it comes, will be received by an audience that includes people with very different relationships to its history. For some viewers, the ending will be the conclusion of a show they have watched for 30 or 40 years, a closing of something that has accompanied them through most of their adult lives. For others, it will be the end of a show they discovered recently through streaming, whose classic episodes they have watched with the same absorption that older fans watched them during their original broadcasts. The grief these two groups will feel about the ending will be differently shaped, but both will be real. The specific form a finale could take has been the subject of extensive fan speculation for years. The most discussed possibility involves the floating timeline finally being allowed to land, the characters finally aging into something like a real future. Others imagine a finale that is not a conclusion in narrative terms, but a farewell in emotional ones, a final episode that knows it is a final episode, and allows itself to say what it could not say while it still had more episodes to produce. The people who make the show have been characteristically coy about what a finale would look like. They are not ready to think about it in those terms, or they are not willing to say so publicly. The show continues. New episodes are ordered. The machine keeps producing, and somewhere in the management structure of Fox and Disney, the financial analysis that determines whether this arrangement continues is being conducted according to criteria that have more to do with advertising rates and streaming metrics than with creative achievement. When the ending finally comes, and it will come, what it will leave behind is one of the most extraordinary creative archives in the history of American entertainment. 700 and more episodes of television that, at its best, demonstrated what the medium was capable of when it was guided by genuine ambition and genuine craft. The ending will not erase that archive. It will, if anything, make it more available to assessment, more fully visible as the complete thing that it will then be rather than the ongoing thing it still is. And in that visibility, whatever the ending looks like, the best of what the show made will continue to do what the best of what the show made has always done. Tell the truth about American life in a way that is funny and sad and honest, and that makes the people watching it feel a little less alone in whatever particular version of Springfield they happen to inhabit. Number Section 11. The critics, the Emmys, and the long argument about whether any of this matters. There is a specific kind of irony in the fact that The Simpsons, a show whose entire creative identity is built on the relentless puncturing of institutional self-congratulation, has also been one of the most honored programs in the history of the Emmy Awards. The show that made jokes about awards shows receiving awards from awards shows. The show that spent 3 decades satirizing the gap between the way American institutions present themselves and the way they actually operate, accumulating trophies from one of those institutions. This irony was not lost on the people making the show. It was, in some respects, the funniest thing the show ever did. The Simpsons won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program in its first season, in 1990. It won it again the following year. Over the course of its run, the show has accumulated more Emmy wins than any other animated program in history, and for the first several years of its run, it won the award with such regularity that the competition in the category seemed almost ceremonial. The show was not merely winning. It was demonstrating that animated television could operate at the level of creative ambition that the Emmys were designed to recognize, in a way that made the question of whether animation deserved serious critical attention feel answered rather than debated. The critical reception of the early Simpsons was, by the standards of television criticism in the late 1980s and early 1990s, extraordinary. Critics who had not previously taken animated television seriously as a subject of genuine analysis were writing about The Simpsons with the kind of attention they gave to prestige drama. The show was being discussed in the same critical conversations as Hill Street Blues and The Wire would be discussed later, as evidence that commercial American television was capable of artistic achievement at the highest level. This reception was complicated from the beginning by the show's own relationship to criticism. The Simpsons has always been deeply aware of how it is perceived, deeply conversant with the critical discourse surrounding it, and deeply skeptical of taking any of that discourse too seriously. The show has referenced its own critical reputation in ways that are simultaneously proud and deflating, claiming the praise while insisting on the absurdity of claiming it. Homer receiving an Emmy and immediately dropping it was a joke the show could have made and would have made and would have made work. The specific critics whose engagement with the show was most influential in establishing its early reputation were, for the most part, not television critics in the traditional sense. They were cultural critics and essayists and academics who were drawn to the show because it seemed to be doing something that television was not supposed to be able to do. It was operating at the level of literature, in the sense of making specific and illuminating observations about American life that went beyond mere entertainment and constituted something closer to a genuine cultural diagnosis. This framing, which was genuinely apt for the show during its best years, created a set of critical expectations that became increasingly difficult to meet as the show's creative trajectory changed. When critics who had been praising The Simpsons for its literary ambitions began encountering episodes that seemed to have abandoned those ambitions for simpler comedy and easier satisfactions, the disappointment was proportionate to the height of the initial praise. You cannot have the critical conversation about The Simpsons being one of the great works of American television and then have a different critical conversation about why it is still worth watching without the second conversation, implicitly referencing and measuring itself against the first. The academic engagement with the show has been substantial, and in some cases genuinely illuminating. The Simpsons has been the subject of more academic writing than any other animated television program and more than most live-action programs as well. Scholars have approached it from the perspectives of cultural studies, philosophy, economics, political science, media theory, and literary analysis. Books have been published examining The Simpsons and philosophy, The Simpsons and society, The Simpsons as a text in various critical traditions. The show has been taught in university courses on American culture, on media studies, on ethics, on economics. The philosophical dimension of this academic engagement is particularly interesting. Several of the show's episodes raise genuine philosophical questions with enough seriousness that they have been used as pedagogical tools in philosophy courses. The episode where Homer discovers that he had a higher IQ before the crayon was inserted in his brain, and chooses to have it reinstated rather than live with the clarity of higher intelligence, raises questions about the relationship between happiness and understanding that philosophers from Socrates forward have wrestled with in canonical texts. The show treats the question with both comedy and genuine gravity, arriving at an answer that is ambivalent and honest in ways that much more formally serious work on the subject has not been. The question of whether The Simpsons constitutes art, and if so, what kind, has been debated since the earliest seasons of the show. This debate is in some ways a product of the specific cultural moment in which the show emerged. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a period in which the boundaries between high and low culture, between legitimate artistic production and commercial entertainment, were being challenged by a generation of cultural producers who were operating in both registers simultaneously and refusing to acknowledge the distinction as meaningful. The Simpsons was made by people who had absorbed both the traditions of elite intellectual culture and the traditions of popular comedy, who could write a joke that required knowing the plot of a specific Updike novel and make it land in a context that was also accessible to someone who had never heard of Updike. This ability to operate across what had been cultural divides was part of what made the show feel new. And the critical establishment's response to it, the Emmys, the academic engagement, the serious critical writing, was a recognition that the division the show was crossing deserved to be recognized. The awards history also contains a specific controversy that is worth addressing directly. As the show's creative output changed through the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Emmy wins continued. The show kept receiving nominations and wins at a rate that many critics felt was more institutional than evaluative, a reflection of the Academy's accumulated goodwill toward a franchise that had genuinely deserved recognition in its earlier years rather than a current assessment of whether the specific episodes being honored were among the best animated television of their year. This criticism was occasionally made explicitly in critical writing about the Emmy results. The argument was that the Academy had, through years of rewarding The Simpsons, developed a kind of default assumption that The Simpsons was the correct answer to the question of what the best animated program of the year was, and that this assumption was not being subjected to the kind of fresh, evaluative scrutiny that the award required. The argument was probably correct in some instances and overstated in others. The show during the Scully era and into the Gene era was not uniformly worse than shows that were being passed over, and the critical consensus about the show's decline, while broadly justified, was sometimes applied with a rigidity that flattened genuine variation in quality between individual episodes. The rise of other animated programs for adult audiences, particularly South Park and Family Guy and later Bob's Burgers and Archer, created a competitive landscape in the awards category that had not existed during the years when The Simpsons dominated it by default. These shows forced a genuine reckoning with the question of what the best animated program actually was in any given year, because there were now multiple strong candidates rather than one presumptive winner. The Simpsons has continued to compete and continues to win occasionally, but it no longer dominates the category in the way that it once did, which is itself a form of critical commentary on how its relative position in the animated landscape has changed. The show's relationship to popular culture criticism conducted outside institutional channels, meaning the fan-generated criticism that has flourished on the internet since the mid-1990s, is a story that deserves its own extended examination. The Simpsons fans who developed the first wave of online fan communities were in many respects the pioneers of television fan culture as it exists today. The Alt.TV, Simpsons newsgroup, which was active from the early 90s, was one of the first places where fans of a television show used the internet to build a community around shared analysis and engagement with the program. The level of specificity and analytical rigor that characterized the best discussions in that community was, by the standards of what preceded it in television fan culture, entirely new. Those communities developed the vocabulary and frameworks that have shaped Simpsons discourse ever since. Terms like flanderization, which originated in online fan discussions and has since passed into common critical usage. The identification of specific eras of the show and their distinctive qualities. The project of cataloging episodes, rating them, arguing about them with the kind of detailed engagement that had previously been reserved for canonical literary texts. All of this happened first in the online fan communities that formed around The Simpsons, and the critical infrastructure those communities built has proven durable enough that it still shapes how people talk about the show 3 decades later. The tension between professional criticism and fan criticism of The Simpsons is something that the show's own creators have had to navigate. The fan community has been, at various points, more demanding in its standards and more specific in its disappointments than the professional critics. When professional critics were still largely celebrating the show during the Scully era, the online fan communities were already developing the arguments about creative decline that would eventually become the mainstream critical consensus. The fans who were most deeply invested in the show's quality were, in some respects, ahead of the professional critical apparatus in recognizing and articulating what was changing. The show's creators have been aware of the online fan discourse throughout its existence. Various people connected to the production have described reading the newsgroups and early fan sites, being aware of how specific episodes were being received by the most devoted segment of the audience. This awareness has shaped the show in ways that are difficult to trace precisely but that are real. Occasionally, the show has acknowledged specific fan theories or discussions directly, as it did with the Homer coma theory. More often, the influence has been subtler, a kind of ongoing awareness of how the most attentive portion of the audience is experiencing the show that has informed creative decisions in ways that resist easy attribution. What the critical history of The Simpsons ultimately demonstrates is something about the relationship between creative ambition and critical expectation that applies far beyond this particular show. When something operates at an exceptional level, it creates expectations that are calibrated to that level. When it subsequently operates at a lower level, the gap between expectation and execution is felt as a failure, even when the work being produced would be celebrated if it had come from a starting point of more modest aspiration. The Simpsons is a victim of its own early excellence in this specific sense. Nothing it produces in its later years can be evaluated entirely on its own terms, because the earlier terms are always present as a reference. This is not a complaint. It is simply a description of what it means to make something extraordinary and then be asked to keep making something. The extraordinary becomes the baseline, and everything subsequent is measured against it. The Simpsons set its own baseline extraordinarily high. and it has been living with that baseline ever since. Number, The Simpsons and Religion, a 36-year negotiation. No topic has generated more sustained creative attention in The Simpsons over its run than religion. The show has returned to religious themes, religious institutions, and religious experience across hundreds of episodes, with a persistence that suggests not merely satirical opportunism, but genuine creative fascination. And the way it has handled religion, with a mixture of genuine respect and genuine irreverence, neither endorsing religious belief nor mocking believers, has produced some of its most interesting and most contested work. The show's religious landscape is centered on the First Church of Springfield, which Homer and the family attend with varying degrees of commitment and varying degrees of belief. The church is administered by Reverend Lovejoy, who voices the kind of professional religious person whose relationship to genuine faith has been so thoroughly mediated by institutional religion that it is sometimes hard to locate. Lovejoy is not a bad person. He is a person who has been doing a job for so long that the job has largely displaced the conviction that once motivated it. He gives sermons on subjects that seem chosen more for their manageability than for their spiritual urgency. He manages the administrative and social functions of the church with professional competence while leaving the deeper questions unaddressed. Homer's relationship to religion is the show's primary vehicle for exploring what religious experience actually is for ordinary people who are neither deeply devout nor militantly secular. Homer believes in God, genuinely. The show establishes this repeatedly and treats it as a real and important aspect of his character. He has conversations with God that are treated as actual conversations rather than hallucinations or metaphors. God exists in the Simpsons universe in a way that is not ironic, and Homer's relationship to God is personal in a way that his relationship to most institutions is not. This creates a productive tension in the show between the skepticism it applies to organized religion, to the church as an institution, to Reverend Lovejoy as a professional religious administrator, and the genuine respect it maintains for Homer's personal faith. The show is not making an argument that religion is foolish. It is making a much more specific and more interesting argument, that there is a gap between the institution and the experience it is supposed to serve, and that this gap is as visible in religion as it is in government, in business, and in every other domain of organized human activity. Ned Flanders represents the show's most extended and most complicated exploration of devout religious belief. His character began as a straightforward foil for Homer, the too-good neighbor whose apparent perfection highlighted Homer's failures. As the show developed Ned across seasons, he became something considerably more interesting. A man whose religious faith is both genuine and psychologically complex, whose devotion to his beliefs coexists with a repressed capacity for rage that the faith has been used to manage rather than resolve. The episode Hurricane Nettie, from Season 8, remains one of the most psychologically acute portrayals of religious crisis in the history of American television comedy. When Ned loses his home in a hurricane, and the community's well-meaning but incompetent reconstruction effort destroys the replacement, Ned's faith is tested in a way the show takes genuinely seriously. His breakdown, in which decades of suppressed frustration finally surface, is not played purely for comedy. It reveals a man who has been performing goodness at enormous personal cost, using religious discipline to contain something that the discipline was not designed to contain, and who has reached the point where the containment has failed. The show's treatment of religious diversity has been less consistent but occasionally illuminating. Krusty the Clown is Jewish, and the show has engaged with this aspect of his character with varying degrees of seriousness. Lisa's conversion to Buddhism, which begins as a season-specific storyline and is subsequently treated with the inconsistency that the floating timeline applies to all character development, represents one of the show's more ambitious engagements with religious belief outside the Christian mainstream. The episodes where Lisa's Buddhism is taken seriously are among the show's most thoughtful treatments of spiritual experience. The episodes where it is simply an established character trait that generates occasional jokes are more typical of how the show handles most of its character material. The specific way the show depicts God is worth discussing in some detail because it is unusual. God appears in a small number of episodes as a character who has a face and a voice and opinions and a relationship to Springfield that is personal rather than abstract. This God is not the God of theology. God in The Simpsons is more like a very powerful neighbor who has been watching the family for a long time and has developed specific feelings about them. This is a theologically absurd conception of divinity that is also, in its way, a very honest depiction of how ordinary people who believe in God actually relate to that belief, as something personal and specific and shaped by their own experience, rather than as something abstract and philosophically rigorous. The show has been careful, across its run, to maintain a kind of tonal neutrality on the question of whether religious belief is rational. It does not argue that Homer's faith in God is misguided. It also does not argue that Ned's religious practice is superior to Homer's more casual relationship to the divine. What it argues, consistently and across many episodes, is that the human need for meaning, for community, for something that transcends the daily frustrations of family and work and the general difficulty of being alive, is real and serious, and deserves to be engaged with honestly rather than dismissed or patronized. This is a more sophisticated position than either militant atheism or uncritical religious affirmation, and it is one that the show has maintained against considerable pressure from both directions. Religious groups have occasionally objected to specific episodes that they felt went too far in their satirical treatment of religious institutions or beliefs. Secular critics have occasionally suggested that the show's treatment of Homer's genuine faith gives too much credence to religious belief. The show has largely ignored both categories of criticism, continuing to treat religion with the same mixture of affection and irreverence that it applies to every other human institution. The long-term effect of this approach on American culture's conversation about religion is difficult to measure but probably real. The Simpsons has been watched by hundreds of millions of people across its run, and the portrait of religious life it has offered, complicated, sometimes hypocritical, genuinely human, not easily reducible to either reverence or mockery, has been part of the cultural landscape in which those viewers have formed their own relationships to religious questions. That is not a trivial contribution. Number. The Simpsons and politics. Satire without a side. The Simpsons has been one of the most politically engaged programs in the history of American television, and it has achieved that engagement while maintaining a principled resistance to partisan alignment that distinguishes it from most political satire. This is a more difficult thing to do than it sounds, and the show's management of it across 36 years and 4+ decades of political upheaval in American life is one of its less celebrated but genuinely significant achievements. The political satire of the early seasons was rooted in a specific observation about American political life that was neither liberal nor conservative in its fundamental orientation: that the institutions of democratic governance are systematically compromised by the interests of concentrated wealth, and that the people who occupy those institutions range from the well-meaning and ineffective to the actively corrupt. Mayor Quimby, Springfield's perpetually re-elected mayor, is a portrait of political corruption that is so comprehensive and so specific that it functions as both comedy and diagnosis simultaneously. Quimby is not the villain of the show's political world. He is something more dismal, the predictable product of a political system that rewards exactly what he is. The show's treatment of the Springfield nuclear power plant as a privately owned facility that operates under essentially no meaningful regulatory oversight, that has compromised every institution of public accountability in Springfield through the influence of its owner, is a piece of political satire that is more pointed in its analysis than most explicitly political content produced during the same period. Burns is not simply a cartoon villain. He is the logical end product of a system in which private wealth is permitted to operate without constraint, and the show has been consistent about the implications of that analysis across its entire run. The specific political references that date episodes are less interesting than the underlying political analysis that does not date. The jokes about specific politicians of the 1990s and 2000s will mean less to viewers who did not live through those political moments. The analysis of how concentrated wealth shapes democratic institutions, how regulatory capture operates, how the interests of the powerful are consistently served by systems that claim to serve everyone. This analysis was true when the show began and is equally true now. The show's refusal to align itself explicitly with either major American political party has sometimes been interpreted as a form of false equivalence, as suggesting that the failures of American political life are symmetrically distributed between the parties. This reading misses something important about how the show's political satire actually works. The show is not arguing that both parties are equally bad. It is arguing that the system itself is structured in ways that systematically serve certain interests over others, and that both parties operate within this system in ways that reflect its structural biases rather than consistently challenging them. This is a more radical critique than partisan alignment would permit. The Lisa Simpson character is, in some respects, the show's primary vehicle for progressive political values. She is environmentally conscious, socially aware, politically engaged, and consistently willing to challenge authority in ways that her family is not. The show treats these qualities with genuine respect, while also, through the specific nature of her situation, acknowledging that intelligence and moral clarity are insufficient to change the world when the institutions and relationships that shape everyday life are resistant to change. Lisa is always right. She is also always outnumbered. The show is honest about both of these things. The episode Marge versus the Monorail from Season 4 is a political parable as much as it is a comedy episode. A traveling salesman sells Springfield a monorail that it does not need and cannot maintain, exploiting the town's combination of civic pride and collective gullibility to extract money from a public treasury that would have been better spent on existing infrastructure. The episode is a comedy, and it is a very funny one. It is also an almost clinically accurate depiction of how public money is extracted by private interests through the manipulation of civic enthusiasm and political vanity. The monorail is not a metaphor. It is a description of a mechanism that operates in actual American municipal politics with depressing regularity. The show's engagement with environmental politics deserves extended attention because it predates the mainstream cultural conversation about climate and environmental degradation by years in some respects. The ongoing presence of the Springfield nuclear power plant as the show's environmental villain, leaking radiation into the water supply and compromising the ecosystem of the surrounding area, established the terms of an environmental critique in the show's first season that has been elaborated and reinforced across every subsequent one. The show has been making the argument that unchecked industrial activity compromises the environment that supports human life for 3.5 decades, and it has been making that argument to an audience measured in hundreds of millions. The show's political satire has occasionally overreached, producing episodes that were more heavy-handed in their messaging than the show's best work. The episodes that are most directly topical, that were written specifically in response to specific political moments, tend to age less well than the episodes that locate their political observation in the ongoing structures of American life, rather than in the specific controversies of a particular moment. The show is most politically acute when it is most specific about the mechanisms of power rather than about the personalities of the powerful. Across its run, The Simpsons has satirized the left and the right with roughly equal frequency but not with perfectly equal bite. The cultural institutions that the show has been most consistently critical of, organized religion as a social institution, concentrated private wealth, the gap between the promises of democratic governance and its delivery, are institutions that a broadly left-of-center analysis tends to emphasize. This has led some observers to categorize the show as fundamentally a liberal cultural product despite its formal commitment to political even-handedness. The categorization is not entirely wrong, but it oversimplifies a show whose most consistent political target is not a specific ideology but the persistent human tendency to accept the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth. Number. The Simpsons and race. The conversation the show kept having despite itself. The racial politics of The Simpsons have been scrutinized with increasing intensity across the show's run, and the scrutiny has produced a body of analysis that reveals something more complicated than either wholesale celebration or wholesale condemnation. The show was made, for most of its run, by a writing room that did not reflect the racial diversity of the country it was trying to depict. The blind spots that resulted from this composition are real and demonstrable. They are also set against a body of work that, at its best, engaged with racial experience in American life with more honesty and care than most mainstream television of any era. The character of Carl Carlson, who is black and who has been Homer's close friend at the nuclear plant since the show's earliest seasons, is a study in both the possibilities and the limitations of representation in a show of this kind. Carl is a regular presence in Homer's life, in the background of the plant, and at Moe's Tavern, and in the social fabric of Springfield that constitutes Homer's world outside his family. He is a character with genuine personality, with relationships and preferences, and a perspective on life that the show occasionally develops in interesting ways. He is also in many respects a background character in his own stories. The episodes that focus specifically on Carl tend to use him as a vehicle for exploring the specific experience of being black in a predominantly white community, with varying degrees of depth and authenticity. Some of these episodes are genuinely thoughtful. Others demonstrate the limitations of writing black characters from outside that experience, producing storylines that would have benefited from the presence in the writer's room of people who understood that experience from the inside. The show's history with characters of various racial and ethnic backgrounds reflects the same combination of ambition and limitation. The episode The Two Misses, Nahasapia Mapedalons, which explores Apu's arranged marriage in a way that engages with the specific cultural pressures of that institution, is an example of the show trying honestly to understand an experience outside the experience of its predominantly white writing staff. The episode is imperfect in specific ways that reflect the limitations of that understanding. It is also more thoughtful than many of the episodes it is compared to, and its imperfections are the imperfections of good faith engagement rather than careless appropriation. The Springfield community as a whole, with its diverse ensemble of recurring characters, reflects an attempt to depict a cross-section of American social life that includes people of various backgrounds. The degree to which this depiction succeeds varies significantly by character and by episode. The characters who receive the most sustained development tend to be white and male, which reflects the composition of the room that created them. The characters who exist primarily as representatives of specific ethnic or racial communities, rather than as fully developed individuals who happen to belong to those communities, tend to suffer from the specific limitations that arise when representation is imposed from outside rather than arising from within. The question of what the show owes to the communities it has depicted across its run is one that has become more rather than less urgent as the cultural context around representation has evolved. The standards that applied to animated television in 1990 were different from the standards that apply now, and the difference reflects real learning about the costs of certain representational practices that was not available to the show's creators when they were making their early decisions. Holding the show accountable to standards that did not exist when it made many of its most consequential choices is a complicated critical exercise. What the show's engagement with race ultimately reveals is the degree to which representation is not simply a question of which characters appear on screen, but of whose perspective shapes how those characters are written. The presence of characters of various backgrounds in Springfield is more visible than the absence of those backgrounds in the room that created them. Making the invisible absence visible requires a different kind of critical attention than cataloging the visible presences, and that kind of attention has been increasingly applied to The Simpsons and to the industry practices it represents. The changes in the industry's approach to writers' room composition that have occurred since 2017, driven in part by the conversation the Apu documentary initiated, have been real, though their scope and permanence remain uncertain. The Simpsons specifically has made some changes to its writing staff's composition in the years since the Apu controversy, though the specific details of those changes have not been fully disclosed. What can be observed from the outside is that the conversations the show has navigated about representation have had some effect on how the industry thinks about these questions, even if the effect on the show's own practices has been less comprehensively transformative than advocates for change have sought. The most honest assessment of The Simpsons and race is probably also the most uncomfortable one. The show has been, at various points in its history, both more thoughtful about racial experience in American life than most of its mainstream contemporaries, and less reflective about the racial composition of its own creative process than the quality of its racial storytelling required. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is not resolvable through either celebration or condemnation alone. It requires the kind of honest, specific engagement that the show itself has always claimed to value, and that the best of its critics have consistently tried to provide. Number, The Simpsons and Family. What the show actually believed about love. Underneath every scandal and every lawsuit and every contract dispute and every creative failure and every cultural controversy, The Simpsons has been, from its first episode to its most recent, a show about a family. About what families are for. About what they cost and what they provide and why people stay inside them when leaving seems, from the outside, like it would be so much easier. Homer and Marge Simpson are not an inspiring couple in any conventional sense. Homer is selfish, irresponsible, frequently oblivious to the effects of his behavior on the people around him, and possessed of a cognitive incapacity for long-term thinking that has produced an archive of catastrophic decisions. Marge is long-suffering to a degree that many observers have found difficult to read as anything other than codependency and the show has occasionally acknowledged this reading in episodes that interrogate her patience rather than simply accepting it as a virtue. And yet, the relationship at the center of this show, the one that the show has returned to and examined and tested across every season of its run, is genuinely moving in a way that is impossible to fully explain in terms of the individual qualities of the people who comprise it. Homer loves Marge. The show is absolutely clear about this, and it is clear in a way that goes beyond mere assertion. The specific ways in which Homer's love for Marge manifests, the extreme lengths to which he will go when her well-being or their relationship is genuinely threatened, the specific quality of his attention when he is actually paying attention, these are not the behaviors of a character for whom love is simply a narrative convenience. They are the behaviors of someone for whom love is the most fundamental organizing fact of his life. The episode "And Maggie Makes Three" from Season 6 is the show's most direct statement about what parenthood means in Homer's experience. The episode uses a flashback structure to reveal how Maggie came to exist and what her arrival meant to Homer, who had finally achieved his dream of working at a bowling alley, and who gave that dream up when Marge became pregnant. The revelation at the episode's end, that Homer keeps Maggie's photographs at the nuclear plant covering the demotivational poster Mr. Burns had put up to demoralize him, is one of the most purely loving moments in the show's history. It says something simple and true about why people accept the costs of love, about how the things and people we are responsible for become the reasons we are able to endure the things that would otherwise be unendurable. The show has depicted Homer and Marge's relationship under strain many times. Episodes have explored infidelity, near infidelity, fundamental incompatibility, the specific ways in which two people who love each other can still make each other genuinely miserable over sustained periods. These episodes are among the show's most honest work, partly because the show does not pretend that love is sufficient to resolve all conflict, and partly because it does not pretend that the conflicts it depicts are trivial. The Bart-Lisa dynamic is one of the great sibling relationships in the history of fiction. Their antagonism is real and specific, and rooted in the particular dynamics of their personalities and their positions within the family. Bart resents Lisa's intelligence and moral certainty. Lisa is frustrated by Bart's apparent indifference to the consequences of his behavior. These are genuine frictions between genuinely different people who happen to share parents and a bedroom and a childhood. What makes the dynamic extraordinary is the tenderness that exists underneath the antagonism, the specific ways in which each of them is the most important person in the other's life, even when they would be the last to admit it. The episodes where this tenderness surfaces, where the antagonism dissolves momentarily and what remains is the specific fact of two people who have known each other their entire lives and who would, if pressed, do almost anything for each other, are among the show's most moving. The show's portrait of childhood is, across its run, one of its most truthful achievements. Bart and Lisa are not idealized children. They are specific and fallible, and sometimes cruel, and sometimes generous. In the specific ways that children are specific and fallible, and sometimes cruel, and sometimes generous, the show takes their experience of childhood seriously, which means taking seriously the ways in which childhood is experienced as genuinely difficult, even when it is also genuinely wonderful, the ways in which being a child in a family is a specific kind of vulnerability that produces both damage and resilience in roughly equal measure. The Homer-Bart relationship is the show's primary exploration of father-son dynamics, and it is more honest about what those dynamics can be than most fiction is willing to be. Homer fails Bart regularly, and in ways that are specific and traceable to failures of attention and imagination rather than failures of love. The strangling, which became a signature joke in the show's early years, represents something that is simultaneously funny as physical comedy and genuinely troubling as a portrait of a parenting style rooted in frustration rather than patience. The show is aware of both dimensions. It never fully commits to treating the strangling as only funny, and it never fully commits to treating it as only troubling. It holds both, which is the honest thing to do. What The Simpsons ultimately believes about family, insofar as a television show can be said to believe anything, is that it is both the most fundamental source of meaning in human life and the most reliable source of the specific pain that comes from caring about people who are capable of disappointing you. These two things are not in contradiction. They are the same fact seen from different angles. Family is where we are most fully ourselves, which means it is where we are most fully capable of both love and failure, and the show has been honest about both for 36 years. That honesty is the foundation of everything else the show has accomplished. The lawsuits and the controversies and the creative disputes and the commercial machinery are all real. The show they surround is realer. It is a portrait of a family, imperfect and persistent and specific, that has spent 36 years telling the truth about what it is to live inside one. That is why people keep watching. That is why, when they stop watching, they do not stop caring. And that is why, when it finally ends, it will be missed in the specific way that things are missed when they have been genuinely part of your life. Number, The Simpsons and television itself, the show that changed the medium. There is a specific kind of influence that The Simpsons had on American television that extends well beyond its own broadcast history, an influence on what television as a medium believed it was capable of and who television as a medium believed its audience to be. Understanding that influence requires understanding what American television looked like before The Simpsons arrived and what it looked like after the show had been running for a decade. The situation comedy landscape into which The Simpsons debuted in 1989 was dominated by a set of conventions so thoroughly established that they had become essentially invisible. Family sitcoms operated according to a grammar of 30-minute narratives with clearly defined arcs, resolutions that restored equilibrium, comedy that was broad enough to offend no one and specific enough to satisfy no one in particular. The shows were competently made and reliably watched and generally forgotten immediately after their run ended. They served a social function as shared, comfortable entertainment, and they executed that function with professional consistency. The Simpsons arrived in this landscape and did something for which the landscape had no prepared response. It took the sitcom seriously as a form. Not seriously in the sense of being solemn or pretentious, but seriously in the sense of believing that the form was capable of more than it had been asked to do, that it could carry emotional weight, that it could be genuinely funny rather than merely competent, that it could have something to say about the world it depicted rather than simply reflecting it back in comfortable and sanitized form. The first wave of the show's influence was on animated television specifically. Ren and Stimpy and Beavis and Butthead and South Park and King of the Hill all followed The Simpsons, each shaped in specific ways by the proof of concept that The Simpsons had provided. The proof was simply that animated television for adults was commercially viable, that audiences existed for it, that the networks were willing to host it. Before The Simpsons, these things were not known. After the show's first several seasons, they were established facts, and the animated television landscape of the 1990s and beyond was shaped by those facts. The influence on live-action television was more diffuse but arguably more consequential. The writers who passed through The Simpsons writers' room in its first decade went on to shape significant portions of the American television comedy landscape. The specific approach to comedy they developed, the attention to character, the tolerance for absurdism alongside emotional honesty, the resistance to easy resolution, these qualities spread through the industry as those writers found new positions and applied what they had learned. The question of what the contemporary prestige television landscape owes to The Simpsons is one that critics have occasionally examined and that mostly remains underexplored. The shows that are now considered the definitive examples of what television can be at its most ambitious, shows that take characters seriously over long arcs, that use the extended duration of serialized television to develop complexity that other narrative forms cannot achieve, are shows that exist in a medium that had been changed by what The Simpsons demonstrated was possible. The specific form of prestige drama is not descended from The Simpsons in any direct genealogical sense. But the cultural conversation about whether television deserved to be taken seriously as an artistic medium, a conversation that produced the conditions in which prestige drama could emerge, is a conversation that The Simpsons made possible. The show's relationship to its own medium has been self-aware in ways that are part of its ongoing project. The Simpsons has always known that it is a television show and has frequently reminded its audience of this fact in ways that range from the gentle to the aggressive. The many episodes that take place in or around television production, that feature characters who are in the television industry, that depict the production of the kind of content that Homer and his family spend their evenings watching, are exercises in a kind of media literacy that the show has been practicing since its earliest seasons. The specific criticism of television that The Simpsons delivers most consistently is the criticism of television as a mechanism of passivity, as something that people do instead of things, rather than as something people do alongside things. The show depicts television watching in Springfield in terms that are recognizably critical of what it does to the people who engage with it, even as it depends on those people engaging with it in exactly the way it is criticizing. This self-implicating quality, the willingness to criticize the mechanism through which the criticism is delivered, is one of the show's most formally interesting qualities. The Itchy and Scratchy Show, the cartoon within a cartoon that Bart and Lisa watch throughout the series, is the show's most sustained piece of television criticism. It is a parody of violent animation that simultaneously reproduces and critiques the violence it depicts. The children in Springfield watch Itchy and Scratchy with the same passive absorption that real children bring to violent media. The adults in Springfield argue about whether the show is harmful in ways that mirror real debates about media violence. And the show continues being broadcast regardless of those arguments because it makes money and because people watch it. The parallel to The Simpsons itself is not subtle. The Simpsons is aware that it is a piece of media produced for commercial purposes in a commercial system. It is aware that it can criticize that system while existing within it. It has spent 36 years navigating this awareness in ways that are sometimes awkward and sometimes brilliant, and always at least honest about the contradiction it is inhabiting. That honesty about its own position, that refusal to pretend that the critique exists outside the thing being critiqued, is one of the most interesting formal qualities of the show and one of the reasons it rewards repeated viewing in ways that simpler forms of satire do not. The legacy of The Simpsons for American television is ultimately less about specific shows it influenced than about the category of possibility it expanded. It demonstrated that animation could be for adults. It demonstrated that comedy could carry emotional weight. It demonstrated that a show could be simultaneously popular and genuinely intelligent, genuinely satirical and genuinely warm, formally ambitious and accessibly entertaining. These demonstrations had consequences that extended far beyond the show itself, consequences that are still playing out in the television landscape that surrounds it. Number The Simpsons and nostalgia. Why we remember it the way we do. The Simpsons occupies a specific and unusual place in the memory of the people who grew up watching it, a place that is different from the place occupied by other formative cultural experiences, and that has to do with the specific qualities of the show itself, rather than simply with the general phenomenon of childhood attachments to media. Most things we loved as children are revealed, when we return to them as adults, to be somewhat less than we remembered. The children's books are simpler. The movies that seem sophisticated are more obviously manipulative. The television shows that felt important now feel thin and formulaic. This experience of retrospective diminishment is so common as to be essentially universal, and it has given rise to a broad cultural skepticism about revisiting beloved childhood media that is usually well-founded. The Simpsons is one of the exceptions, not because childhood nostalgia has blinded its fans to its flaws, but because the show at its best was genuinely more accomplished than it seemed when it was airing, and returning to it as an adult reveals qualities that were always present but that younger viewers were not equipped to fully appreciate. The specific texture of the satire, the precision of the character work, the formal intelligence of the episode construction, these things were there in the 1990s. They become more visible with the perspective that comes from having lived through more of what the show was depicting. This creates a specific dynamic in how fans relate to the show's different eras. The Golden Age episodes, which, for most fans who were children in the early to mid-90s, correspond to a period they were between the ages of 8 and 15, were experienced at the time as excellent but not analyzed. They were absorbed rather than understood. Returning to them as adults and finding not just the remembered pleasure but a genuine depth of craft produces a specific quality of gratitude that is different from ordinary nostalgia. It is the experience of discovering that something you loved contained more than you knew. The emotional mechanics of Simpsons fandom are worth examining because they reveal something about why the show matters in the specific way it matters to the people for whom it matters most. The show was, for a generation of American children, the most sophisticated cultural product aimed at them. It treated them as intelligent without being condescending about its own intelligence. It made them feel that they were smart enough to appreciate something good, which is one of the most powerful things any cultural experience can do for a young person. The memory of that experience, of being 12 years old and understanding a joke that required knowing something about American literature, or political history, or the structure of cinematic conventions, is a memory that carries forward into adulthood as a kind of foundational cultural confidence. The Simpsons taught a generation of viewers to expect more from popular entertainment than popular entertainment typically delivered. And the disappointment that many of those viewers feel about the show's later seasons is, in part, the disappointment of a standard the show itself set not being maintained. The generational transmission of the show has produced an interesting phenomenon in which younger viewers, who encountered the show through streaming services rather than through its original broadcast, have developed a relationship to it that in many respects mirrors the relationship the original audience developed. The episodes hold up. The comedy is genuinely funny to people who are encountering it for the first time without the context of the show's cultural moment. The characters are legible and engaging in ways that do not require familiarity with the specific cultural references they originally drew on. This transhistorical legibility is one of the show's most remarkable qualities, and one that distinguishes it from most of the comedy that was produced around it. Shows that were considered equally sophisticated or equally funny during the same period have aged less well, because their humor was more dependent on specific cultural references or specific modes of comedy that have dated. The Simpsons' humor, at its best, derives from something more durable, from the specific truth of characters whose qualities are genuinely human and whose situations illuminate genuinely permanent features of American life. The nostalgia that surrounds The Simpsons is, in this sense, doing something more honest than most nostalgia manages. It is not simply preserving the feeling of childhood attachment to something that has not held up. It is recognizing, through the lens of adult perspective, something that was genuinely good when it was encountered, and that remains genuinely good when it is revisited. That recognition is rarer than it should be, and the show's capacity to produce it, consistently, across multiple generations of viewers encountering it at different moments in their lives, is one of the most meaningful things that can be said about it. The conversations that happen between people who love The Simpsons, the arguments about which era is the best, which episodes are the most essential, which moments are the most moving or the funniest or the most formally accomplished, these conversations are a form of cultural inheritance. They pass something from one person to another about what good television looks like, and what good storytelling feels like, and what it means for a piece of popular culture to take its audience seriously. The show has been generating those conversations for 36 years, and it will continue to generate them long after it stops producing new episodes, because the archive it has left behind is rich enough to sustain that conversation indefinitely. Number. The Simpsons and music. The soundtrack of an era. The music of The Simpsons deserves more attention than it typically receives in discussions of the show's creative achievement. Danny Elfman's theme is so thoroughly embedded in American cultural memory that it has transcended its origin and become simply part of the acoustic landscape in which Americans live. It is one of those pieces of music that people recognize before they have consciously identified it, that triggers associations and feelings below the level of active attention. That quality, the quality of music that has become genuinely foundational to a culture's sonic environment, belongs to very few pieces of television music in the medium's history. Elfman composed the theme in 1989 in a short window of time, by his own account. The result is a piece of music that does several things simultaneously with a craft that is more sophisticated than casual listening reveals. It is playful and slightly anxious, light and slightly dark, familiar and slightly strange. These qualities mirror the show's own tonal balance, and this is not a coincidence. Elfman was given a clear brief about what the show was trying to be, and the theme reflects that brief with the economy and precision of a composer who understood what was being asked of him. Alf Clausen served as the show's primary composer from the 3rd season through the 27th, a tenure of more than 2 decades that represents one of the longest sustained musical collaborations in television history. Clausen's approach to the show's scoring reflected a deep engagement with the specific emotional and comedic requirements of each scene, producing music that functioned as an active, creative element rather than simply as background decoration. The specific qualities of his scoring, its tendency toward pastiche and parody of existing musical styles, its willingness to use musical references as a form of joke in themselves, were central to the show's overall aesthetic, in ways that became fully visible only when he departed and the scoring was handled differently. Clausen's dismissal in 2017, after 27 years of work on the show, came without what observers described as the kind of recognition that his tenure deserved. He learned of his replacement not through a direct conversation with the production, but through industry reporting. The circumstances of the transition generated criticism from within the music community, where his work on the show was well regarded, and from fans who noticed the change in the show's sonic character in the seasons following his departure. His replacement by a different scoring approach reflected a cost reduction decision as much as a creative one, and the decision was handled in ways that were felt as disrespectful to someone who had contributed significantly to the show's identity across a long career. The original songs that the show has produced across its run represent a body of musical work that is genuinely remarkable in its range and quality. The show has written and produced hundreds of original songs across its history, ranging from brief comedic ditties to fully developed musical numbers with genuine musical ambitions. The best of these songs, the ones that have persisted in cultural memory well beyond the episodes that contained them, demonstrate a compositional sophistication that goes beyond the requirements of cartoon parody. The musical episode, Homer's Barbershop Quartet, built around a premise that allowed the show to produce original music in the style of Beatles-era popular music, is among the most formally ambitious things the show produced during its peak years. The episode creates its own fictional musical history, inventing a past for Homer that places him at the center of a fictional musical phenomenon, and the songs produced for the episode function not merely as jokes, but as genuine musical works that earn the comedic premise rather than simply illustrating it. The Simpsons' relationship to its music has been complicated, in the streaming era, by the licensing questions that have affected many television shows from the same period. Music rights are expensive and complex, and the cost of clearing original music rights for streaming distribution has led some platforms to substitute different music for original broadcasts in ways that change the shows significantly. The Simpsons has been affected by this in specific episodes where musical choices were essential to the comedic or emotional effect of specific scenes. The version of those episodes available to contemporary viewers through streaming is, in these cases, a meaningfully different artifact from the version that originally aired. The show's contribution to American musical culture extends beyond its own original production into the specific ways it has shaped how Americans relate to existing music. Episodes that feature specific pieces of existing music in specific contexts have contributed to the cultural meaning of that music in ways that are difficult to trace but real. When the show uses a piece of music in a specific emotional or comedic context, it creates an association between that music and that context that persists in the memories of the viewers who encountered it. The music means something slightly different afterward, inflected by the specific use the show made of it, and this accumulated influence on how Americans hear and understand music is part of the show's cultural legacy. A final note on the show's strangeness. There is something genuinely strange about The Simpsons that does not get discussed often enough, a quality that exceeds the strangeness of its content or its longevity or its cultural reach. The strangeness is this: no one has fully explained why it worked. Television executives, network development teams, studio financiers, all of these are people who are professionally invested in understanding what makes television work, in developing frameworks for predicting which projects will succeed and which will fail, in reducing the unpredictability of creative success to something that can be managed and replicated. They have studied The Simpsons extensively, and they have tried to apply whatever lessons they extracted from it to subsequent projects. And the subsequent projects have almost never achieved anything close to what The Simpsons achieved. This is partly because the conditions that produced The Simpsons were historically specific in ways that cannot be replicated. The specific combination of people involved, the specific cultural moment in which the show arrived, the specific state of the television industry that allowed it the creative latitude it needed in its early years, none of these can be reproduced on demand. But it is also because the show had a quality that the frameworks do not capture, a quality that is easier to identify in retrospect than to predict in advance. That quality is something like seriousness about comedy. The people who made the early Simpsons were genuinely interested in what they were doing in a way that exceeded the commercial investment. They cared about whether the jokes were good in a way that went beyond whether the jokes were functional. They cared about whether the characters were true in a way that went beyond whether the characters were likable. They were trying to make something that was actually as good as it could be, not merely as good as it needed to be, and the difference between those two standards is the difference between work that endures and work that is forgotten. The 36 seasons that followed those early years are a record of what happens when that quality of seriousness about comedy is maintained, and a record of what happens when it is not. The episodes that still feel alive when you return to them are the ones made by people who cared about whether they were good. The episodes that feel hollow are the ones made under conditions that required production but did not require genuine creative investment. Both are part of the record, and the record is honest about both. Springfield, in the end, is what happens when people take something seriously that the culture treats as trivial. A cartoon, a comedy, a show for people who want to be entertained on Sunday nights. The Simpsons took these things seriously and produced something that will still be discussed and debated and watched and analyzed when everyone currently involved in making it is long gone. That is the strange thing. That is the thing that nobody fully planned or predicted or managed. That is the thing that lasts. Number closing. 4 hours in Springfield. That is what we set out to do, and here we are at the other end of it. We have been through the courtrooms where people fought over who created The Simpsons and who deserved to profit from it. We have been inside the writers' rooms where the show's golden era was forged, and where it eventually came apart, not through any single catastrophic failure, but through the slow accumulation of small choices that pointed in a different direction. We have sat through the contract negotiations where the voices of Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa were made available to the highest bidder, and watched the negotiations that almost ended those arrangements. We looked at the episodes the show would prefer you had not seen, and the others it would rather you had forgotten. We examined the controversy that forced American entertainment to reckon honestly with who was in the room when its most beloved characters were being invented. We walked through the underground world that shaped The Simpsons before it existed, and we reckoned with the darkness that world eventually revealed. We cataloged the celebrities who came to Springfield and the ones who refused the invitation. We traced the long, complicated arc of a creative decline that is real and not fully anyone's fault. We added up the money. The toys and the t-shirts and the theme park rides and the streaming rights and the arcade games and the merchandise licenses and the 40 years of advertising revenue. We tried to account for what all of that money did to the show it came from, and to be honest about the fact that the answer is both everything and nothing. And we ended with the question that sits underneath all of it. What happens when it ends? And why hasn't it ended yet? The Simpsons is not just a television show. By this point, it is a record. It is the longest record in American entertainment of what a specific kind of creative ambition looks like when it runs up against commercial pressure and institutional inertia and the simple passage of time. The record is not pretty at every point. It contains mistakes and misjudgments, and moments where the people responsible for the show made choices that were wrong in ways that can be identified and described and argued about with the clarity of hindsight. It also contains 36 years of extraordinary effort, of people trying to make something good inside conditions that did not always support goodness, of writers and performers and animators and producers coming to work every day with the aspiration of producing something that would matter. Not every episode achieved that aspiration. Enough of them did to make the archive, taken in its entirety, one of the genuinely remarkable creative accomplishments in the history of American television. Springfield is still there. The lights in the house on Evergreen Terrace are still on. The couch gag is still playing. And somewhere out there, Homer is still falling backward into that hedge, astonished, every time, that the world contains something he did not see coming. Don't we all? The Simpsons was made by people who believed that comedy could tell the truth. Not approximately. Not in the way that entertainment usually tells the truth, which is to say, with one eye on whether the truth is comfortable enough to be acceptable. The real truth. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that makes you sit back and recognize something about yourself or your world that you had been successfully not noticing. That belief, the belief that comedy and truth are not merely compatible, but that comedy is sometimes the most direct route to truth, is what made the show extraordinary when it was extraordinary. It is also what made the later seasons feel like a loss, because the later seasons sometimes seem to have lost track of that belief, seem to be producing entertainment instead of revelation. The difference between entertainment and revelation is real, and the show knew the difference, and the fans knew the difference, and the gap between what the show had been and what it became was felt with the specific grief that comes from watching something lose track of what it was best at. But the revelation is still there, in the archive. 700 and more episodes of a family in a town that does not exist, doing things that could not happen, saying things that somehow managed to be true. That archive is what the show leaves behind. That archive is what all the lawsuits and the negotiations and the controversies and the near collapses were protecting, sometimes knowingly and sometimes inadvertently. Go find the episodes you haven't seen. Go back to the ones you love. Pay attention to the corners of the frames. Listen to the background music. Notice the jokes in the newspaper headlines and the book spines and the signs on the buildings. The show put effort into everything, even the things it knew you might never notice. And the evidence of that effort is everywhere in the work it left behind. Springfield is still there. It will always be there. The lights are on. The people who made The Simpsons at its best were trying to create something that would reach people. They wanted the jokes to land not just because jokes are their job, but because landing means connection, means someone on the other end of the screen feeling recognized, feeling like the thing they are watching understands something about their life. That ambition is harder than it looks and less common than it should be. And when it is achieved, when the connection actually happens between the work and the person receiving it, it is one of the most ordinary and most extraordinary things that human beings do. They did it millions of times across 36 seasons. The lawsuits did not stop them. The contract disputes did not stop them. The creative failures did not stop them. The controversies and the personnel changes and the commercial pressures and the accumulated weight of producing something of quality year after year after year did not stop them. The Simpsons is still here, still yellow, still frozen in its eternal Springfield present, still watching us watch it. And somewhere in a hospital bed, Homer is still dreaming. The dream is still running. The family is still together. For the 36 years it has been running, The Simpsons has done something that television almost never manages. It has made the same people laugh and feel and think and recognize themselves in something across childhood and adolescence and adulthood and middle age, and it has done this without ever fully becoming predictable, without ever losing the capacity to surprise even people who thought they knew exactly what the show was. The best episodes still land. The best jokes still work. The best moments of genuine feeling still cut through, even for people who have seen them a dozen times, even for people who are seeing them for the first time in their 40s when they should theoretically be too old for this. That is the real mystery of The Simpsons. Not who shot Mr. Burns, not whether Homer is in a coma, not where Springfield is on a map. The real mystery is why this specific combination of a family and a town, and a nuclear power plant, and a billionaire who cannot die, and a baby who never speaks, and a dog who should not be alive, has managed to mean so much to so many people, for so long. The answer to that mystery is not in any of the stories we've told tonight. It is in the show itself. In the specific episodes that matter to you personally, in the moments that made you feel something you did not expect to feel while watching a cartoon. Go find those moments. They are worth finding again. Good night.